Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. My name is Karmon, and I am a senior researcher at ICT, International Institute for Counter-Terrorism, and also at IPS, the Institute for Policy and Strategy, the two institutes, more important institutes at IDC. We'll begin immediately after a very short movie that ICT wants to present you. So again, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm privileged to be chairman of this workshop on Syria. I think it's one of the main issues today, not only for the Syrian people, but also for the neighboring countries, and we have representatives from neighboring countries here, for the region, the Middle East, but also for the global arena. And I think that your presence here shows that this subject interests a lot of people. And I'm privileged that we have here panelists, which every one of them is expert in his specific subject that he will present here, but also in all, for many of the subjects which include the Middle East, the terrorism in the Middle East, and insurgency, and clear also international relations. The title of this workshop is the Syrian Quagmire. I like this word in English, which is a word which expresses the complexity, but also I would say the explosive complexity of an issue. And indeed, the situation in Syria today is in a very, very difficult point in the long civil war, which began in March 2011. And I would like to remind people here that this war began actually by a popular Pacific uprising in southern Syria, which was practically destroyed by the huge oppression, cruel oppression by the regime. And actually, in a quite short time, and in spite of the fact that there was an attempt to build a huge opposition army, the Syrian Liberation Army, practically many of the jihadist group which began to appear on this arena, some of them local jihadist groups and others imported from abroad, including the foreign fighters, became a very protected war between the regime on the one hand, the very divided opposition. I think once we made some kind of attempt to number the number of these kind of groups, subgroups and sub-subgroups, and we arrived at the conclusion that when you see the diagram of the rebel groups, there are some 60, 70, but actually there are hundreds of warlords which are leading such kind of groups. There is no clear link between, and also lineage between these groups and other groups. There is a huge division inside them. And this is a result, in my opinion, of the fact that the West, especially the United States, but also Europe, I call it, outsourced the conflict, this very complex conflict, to the regional powers. And all the powers involved were actually some kind of Islamist powers. Turkey, which since 2002 and until 2011-12 became more of an Islamist regime. Clearly Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the Emirates, everyone with its own agenda, ideological, but also political and strategic, And this kind of division and very conflicted interest has brought us to a situation when the civil war almost destroyed completely the framework of the Syrian state. And by the summer of 2015, actually, the regime in Damascus, the Assad regime, was on the threshold of being destroyed by the opposition, because the success of the opposition in, if you want, occupying or liberating or taking control of the Idlib region in northwestern Syria actually threatened directly the heartland of the Alawi community. And at this moment, when even the Iranians and the Hezbollah, which were the main supporters on the ground of the Syrian regime, understood that they are not able to save the regime from crumbling, and perhaps even the Alawite community to be savagely destroyed by the Sunni jihadists, they asked Russia to intervene. And actually, the Russian intervention changed completely the strategic situation, and we are today, after practically 3 years of intense Russian intervention, which is not only military, not only the Air Force, but also intelligence and also political support for the Assad regime, and also its alliance, at least until the moment, with the Iranians and the Hezbollah and the Shia militias against the very divided Syrian opposition, has brought the situation at the point where practically, if Idlib, the province of Idlib, will fall, the regime will take control practically of most of the country. But what we, until now, try to analyze as a researcher of terrorism was the activity and the threat and the impact of the various, very diverse terrorist groups, and not only those of the Sunni jihadists. I remind always the audiences that there are tens of thousands of militias, Shia militias, not only the Hezbollah, but also the Iraqi militias, some 7, 8 brigades or katibas or liwas. You have also, last 2-3 years, Afghani, Pakistani, and Iraqi militias. So this kind of war between terrorist, insurgent, guerrilla groups has practically transformed itself in a war between the regional powers. And in this war, all the neighboring countries, including other Arab countries in the region, are involved in a way or another, and also the global powers, and first of all, Russia and the United States. And lately you see that even China has asked the Syrian government to be involved in the liberation of the Idlib region, probably because they are afraid of the hundreds of thousands of Uyghur Muslim jihadists there. So, as I said, we have a very diverse panel of experts on every one of these aspects of the conflict. I try to do it, if you want, not in a chronological way, but also the importance of the players involved. And because we are at this point, as I said, that the fight for Idlib will decide the fate of many of the rebel groups, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is actually a coalition around the former Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, which was defeated in most of the Syrian territory, but also dozens of other organizations. So the first panelist or the first expert will speak about the situation of the opposition. Is there still an opposition? What is the level of regime control in the already liberated areas? What is the remains of the Syrian opposition which is fighting the regime? And the chances of a diplomatic solution to the conflict, especially the chances of a solution, a Russian solution, or a Pax Russa. And also to refer, as I asked the speaker, also about the Shia militias, because again, not only the Sunni militias and groups are threatening. So Mr. Charles Lister is Senior Fellow and Director of the Extremism and Counterterrorism Program at the Middle East Institute in the United States. He was also visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution in Qatar. He was involved in a track 2, or if you want, a Syria study group on issues of terrorism and insurgency across the Levant. The Levant is more than Syria, it's all the region practically, includes also Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine perhaps. And his focus is primarily on the Syrian conflict. He also, as I said, a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution, but in Qatar, which is also a very important point of reference for many of the groups involved in the rebel opposition and the jihadist opposition. He has published a very acclaimed book, The Syrian Jihad, Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and the Evolution of an Insurgency, published by Oxford University Press, and he is writing now a third book on Syria. Cheers, please.
Okay, so first of all, good afternoon, everyone. As you hear, I've got just a little bit of stuff to cover in the next 15 to 20 minutes, so I'll do my best to keep to time. First of all, I guess, actually, first question is, how do I change the slides? Is that on here? Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you. So I guess the first thing to say is, I think the title, I'm always amiss to say I actually don't like using certain labels, but I do think Quagmire is an apt one at this particular stage of the conflict. Why do I say that? Because I think it's becoming increasingly common to hear people say the conflict is ending, it's coming to a close, the opposition is dying, Russia is taking control. And frankly speaking, although many of those descriptors might very well be largely correct, the conclusion isn't that the conflict is going to end. It's certainly not that stability is about to spread across Syria. And so the quagmire is something that one could attach to a whole variety of different actors, both inside and outside of the country. But in a sense, I think what we've really seen develop over the last recent 6 to 12 months is a real international fatigue on one end of the conflict, the one that was always backing the opposition, and that means sort of collectively speaking the West plus many regional states. And a lot of that, my concern about that fatigue and the consequence that it is having, which is basically an increasing indifference about the fate of the conflict, is that what's resulting is very short-termist thinking about where we are now and where that's going to lead us. And I think almost every single state in the region is arguably guilty of that, as is the West collectively. And I think really that's going to play a fairly significant role in underpinning a lot of what I'm going to say today. The threats emanating from Syria all remain. None of them have been defeated or squashed. The root causes of the conflict in Syria that began in 2011 not only remain the same, they have got worse over the last 7 years. So just addressing those two facts, one finds it very difficult to talk about the conflict ending and a sense of stability and stabilization about to begin. This Syrian quagmire is going to be an extremely long-term problem, both for the region and for the international community. And my kind of hypothesis at this point is that the solution to this long-term problem is arguably being made worse every single day by the collective international indifference about what the situation on the ground is right now and the trajectory that we're on. That's not me advocating regime change, that's me advocating just simply a more aggressive involvement in settling the conflict. So to the first slide. Oh, I should first add, I hate making PowerPoint presentations, but I expected that it was expected of me, so I've made 3 slides. So maybe they'll add a little component to some of the things that I'll say. But I'm going to start by talking about the big picture, which I think the transition of this map, thanks to the Omran Center, which I think makes some of the best maps on Syria, that's basically what happened in the last 12 months, the transition in terms of territorial control. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen a huge transformation of the conflict. The balance of power on the ground, the dynamics between different actors, the levels of support and involvement of international actors, both from the region and further afield. And that has translated into clear to see changes on the ground, but a lot of other things under the surface. As I've already said, we've seen during this 12 to 18 month time period, I think, an increasing indifference on behalf of the West, or a disinvestment in continuing to push the conflict towards a meaningful political settlement. And I emphasize a meaningful political settlement, because I think the one that we are getting closer and closer towards isn't going to mean a true settlement of the conflict and a dealing with the root causes. A lot of that disinvestment has come as a result of a preoccupation with symptoms of the conflict, most notably ISIS. ISIS is not a cause of the conflict in Syria. It is one of many symptoms. And a collective Western obsession, and I've used that word many times, with the threat from ISIS has meant that we have taken our eye off why ISIS emanated in the way that it did from Syria and how it grew so significantly thanks to what happened in Syria. But the root causes are still the root causes. We've also seen increasing regional fatigue and a lack of bandwidth, particularly from the Gulf, and particularly as a result of the war in Yemen. The Saudis largely detached themselves from the crisis in Syria a long time ago. The Qataris have played an extremely minimal role over the last 12 to 18 months. The Emiratis were almost indifferent to the conflict 2 or 3 years ago. So a lot of the common conceptions about Gulf support to Syria over the last 2 or 3 years are somewhat misleading. What we've also seen as a result of all of that is the consolidation by a very united pro-regime alliance, as you all know, bringing together Russia and Iran. And that is precisely how we have started to see this map shift. Probably the most important point I could make here, and again a bit of a complaint about some of the things I've described, is that the most crucial dynamic that led us onto this and that resulted from some of the things I've just described is what has been known as the de-escalation regime, the de-escalation design for Syria. This was a Russian proposal. This was a Russian-designed effort to de-escalate the conflict, which for many in the international community who desired a less intense conflict, who didn't want to continue to be involved in the Syrian Quagmire, seemed like a pretty attractive proposition. In fact, what we've basically seen as a result of this de-escalation design is this transition on the map. Russia quite clearly knew, as did much of the international community, that by creating de-escalation zones in the 4 critical areas of conflict in the country, that was the northwest, which is still green today, the southwest, which we've most recently seen fall under regime control, areas around Damascus, which are now under regime control since earlier this year, and areas around Homs in the center of the country. The consequence of that was to free up the regime, give it breathing room, and allow it to reposition and prepare for a much more methodical advance against the opposition. And why do I say that? The regime for years had suffered from a severe manpower shortage. We all know it had had to divest and invest, thanks to Iranian and to some extent Russian support, in militia forces to fill that gap. But the Russians knew more than anyone, because they believe in the Syrian army as being the central arm of the state, that the manpower problem had to be fixed, and fixed urgently. And the de-escalation design for Syria fixed that problem perfectly. So basically what we saw was a brief period of breathing room for the regime to bring back its centralized Syrian army forces, and then they picked off one de-escalation zone at a time, with little to no international complaint. Most remarkably for the United States, we were one of the lead powers in negotiating the de-escalation zone in southwestern Syria, and yet when it was destroyed, for want of a better term, we didn't even issue a statement about it from the State Department. So that kind of sums up this kind of collective resignation and disinterest and disinvestment in continuing to control some of the dynamic conflict with the regime, which is really what I work on most of the time when it comes to Syria. This slide is a very sort of basic summary of what's remaining of armed groups in Syria who still control territory, still fight the regime, and who still control territory and who still fight the regime. I've included ISIS here, though I wouldn't normally label them the opposition. They have an entirely different vision, an entirely different agenda, but for the sake of keeping everyone on one slide, they're there. But to sort of, briefly summarize who this is, and I should say we're just talking about very small pockets of territory in eastern Syria along the Iraqi border, along the Euphrates River, which is ISIS-held territory. And then with regards to the three other groups or umbrellas that you see there, we're talking about exclusively the northwest of Syria. The National Liberation Front is a relatively new umbrella of forces which are 95% under Turkish command. The Turkish military and Turkish intelligence service largely control all of the actions, the continued sources of support, both financial and military, to these fighters, who number, according to my estimates, roughly 20,000 fighters, some of whom have gone through training by the Turkish military, both inside Syria and across the border in southern Turkey. But this is an umbrella which has expanded increasingly in terms of its ideological breadth. The National Liberation Front started as a collectively Free Syrian Army umbrella of forces, largely in Idlib, and has since encompassed all of the groups that I list after those 10 FSA groups. Faylaq al-Sham is a front of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's basically the Brotherhood's armed wing. Nuruddin al-Zinki, a very complicated movement from Aleppo, which in various times has been affiliated with the Free Syrian Army and Al-Qaeda. Ahrar al-Sham, which again similarly has a very complicated history but has become increasingly openly determined to affiliate itself with the more nationalist part of the revolution rather than the Salafist one. And Jaish al-Ahrar, which remains fairly solidly on the Salafi jihadi end of the spectrum, but opposed specifically to any kind of sort of global jihad. So it's a very broad umbrella, but I guess the most important dynamic to bear in mind is it remains wholly loyal to Turkish instruction. So when we're looking at Idlib and the fate of Idlib, whatever happens there, the NLF will almost certainly follow exactly what the Turks tell it to do. The next group down is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. I could give a 3-hour lecture on HTS, but probably to save all of you, I won't. But HTS is an extremely complicated movement. I think I indicated some of that in the plenary session yesterday. They number roughly 12,000 fighters. They're an extremely potent military actor who probably controls or heavily influences about 60% of northwestern Syria, which remains under opposition control. But despite that military influence, they have never been less popular within the opposition movement. They have potentially existentially damaged their credibility within opposition eyes over the last 12 to 18 months. Whereas Nusra was genuinely quite popular because of a lot of its military successes, its reputation for having a lack of corruption, HTS has proven itself to be much more of a unilateralist actor, far more concerned with its own interests, despite its rhetoric pointing to an interest in the rest of the Syrian revolution. But they have, interestingly, as a former Al-Qaeda affiliate, and we can get into that whole discussion if you want me to explain that, but as a former Al-Qaeda affiliate, they have specifically sought relationships with foreign governments. And for me, as someone who really specializes in this group more than anything else, has been something fascinating and intriguing to try and study and understand, because they remain a Salafi jihadi actor. They are an extremist organization which deserves to be, at this point in time at least, designated as a terrorist organization. And yet they specifically seek diplomatic, and that's the term they use, relationships with foreign governments. They engage with the international aid community. They do not add up to the general reputation of groups that have been or previously been linked to Al-Qaeda. I just realized the last line of that slide shouldn't be there, so please ignore it. Then we have Tanzim Huras al-Din, which, to cut an extremely long story short, formed after HTS ended up breaking away from Al-Qaeda. A huge public falling out happened after Jabhat al-Nusra rebranded to Jabhat Fatah al-Sham and then to Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Those series of rebrands were an attempt to prove to the local population that they were something different. Those rebrands failed, hence the lack of credibility I talked about earlier. But Tanzim Haras al-Din was the natural consequence of that falling out. We had Ayman al-Zawahiri issuing video statements in which he publicly acknowledged for the first time that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was no longer part of al-Qaeda. They had illegitimately betrayed their oath of bay'ah to the organization. They had betrayed their religion by seeking nationalist goals and by establishing relationships with foreign governments. So the fighters that ended up forming Tanzim Haras al-Din were those who completely refused to join the HTS project and who insisted on remaining explicitly loyal to al-Qaeda and its global brand of jihad. Interestingly, according to the last information I got, Haras al-Din's Shura Council includes at least one member of al-Qaeda's global Shura Council. So this is specifically al-Qaeda Central's investment in creating an official affiliate with direct reach back to Afghanistan and Pakistan in northwestern Syria. They couldn't be any more dedicated to the original vision of bin Laden as we currently stand. And I've got lots of other interesting things to talk about them, but I'll leave that to later. And then finally we have the Islamic State, which, yes, is not defeated, despite proclamations made in Iraq and in Syria, still very much alive. A broad range of estimate there. 4,000 is probably the number that I might reach. 14,000 was the number recently leaked from a classified DIA assessment in the United States. They said roughly 14,000 fighters in Syria and a little bit more than that still in Iraq. I frankly think those numbers are a little inflated, but nevertheless it does still give you an idea that the group is far from gone. Remain an extremely capable military actor, who has effectively fallen back to the desert for strategic depth. And there's a variety of potential options for them in terms of exploitation to continue to survive. But in brief, that's where we still are in terms of armed groups that are fighting the regime, still controlling territory, and still basically carrying weapons. Briefly, before I get onto this slide, I was at the last minute asked also to talk about Hezbollah and Shia militias. I mean, what can I say other than that? In numbers, they far outnumber all four of those groups that I just listed. Hezbollah cycles around at least 7,000 fighters in Syria at any one time, though I think I would argue those numbers may very well have reduced in number in the last few months due to strategic priorities. But certainly there's still a significant number. The Afghan and Pakistani fighters number at least 10,000 by themselves. Other foreign Shia militiamen from Iraq, from Lebanon, from Yemen and elsewhere, arguably number roughly 10,000 extra. So foreign Shia militiamen, we're still talking 25,000 in total. And then the work that Iran has invested inside Syria in creating parallel security structures has resulted in an array of other militias, some collectively under what's called the National Defense Force and the Local Defense Force. Others are entirely independent. But those who are directly under Iran's command arguably number, as Syrians, at least 50,000. There is now also Syrian Hezbollah, which has recruitment offices on the coast in Latakia and Tartus. And that is almost certainly going to be something that we should be keeping a close eye on in the future. But it's pretty clear to me that these groups on the Shia end of the spectrum, A, qualify to be terrorist organizations in many of their respects, and B, aren't going to be leaving Syria anytime soon either. And so it is just as important, and I'm glad that I was asked to at least briefly touch on them, just as important to bear in mind their role in Syria, pre or post Idlib, in terms of determining the future trajectory of the state, in terms of a conflict of interests with the Russians who oppose this reality. And in talks with Israel, I think that's been quite clear, although finally, thank God, the Russians admitted that we can't actually get Iranian militiamen to leave Syria. I'm glad they finally spilled that, because believing that they could was always a little bit of a fantasy. But that is going to be a key linchpin of conflict, not military conflict, but political, diplomatic conflict between Russia and Iran going forward, particularly if Idlib is eventually recaptured. So, to sort of conclude out of all of this, with a gradual trajectory of regime expansion and consolidation has come a number of new big item pictures or titles in the international community. The first big one, for obvious reasons, is the issue of refugee returns. Another is reconciliation, whatever that might mean. And the third, pushed by the UN, is the idea of constitutional reform and eventually national elections. Talk of all of these things is far too early for the reasons that I laid out at the beginning of my presentation. There is nowhere safe to return as a refugee. I can give you a whole variety of sort of anecdotes on that. The BBC recently got given a tour by the Russian military through Homs, through the old city of Homs, which was recaptured by the regime years ago. It was rubble. Not a single human being could be seen in the entire old city of Homs. The regime had done nothing to rebuild or to stabilize or to reinvest. So nobody had returned to that area. In southwestern Syria, which was effectively ceded to the regime in the last few months, there's already been mass arrest campaigns of individuals who were involved in civilian council work, who were involved in providing medical care in communities under opposition control. There have been individuals who chose to return from places like Jordan who have since been disappeared, including elderly men, elderly women, and several young boys. So the message that sends to local communities who have fled to either be an IDP or a refugee is, don't come back. The biggest, most potent message that the regime has sent in the last few weeks to refugees is a series of statements by Jamil Hassan, the leader of the Air Force Intelligence Directorate, the most powerful of the 4 intelligence wings in Syria. And in these comments, he said that 3 million Syrians who are known to be alive are wanted for terrorism charges, in other words, a death penalty. 3 million Syrians who are not living under regime control are wanted on charges of death by the regime. So the direct implication of that is we don't want refugees back, thank you very much. He also then talked about them as germs that needed to be cleansed and as sheep and pigs and a variety of other things. So the message coming from the regime is they don't want refugees back. Bashar al-Assad has made that patently clear in the past. If you fled our country, you no longer belong in the future Syria. But Russia, of course, is presenting this image to the international community that Syria is now safe, we want refugees to come back, this is an opportunity for all of you as regional states and as Europe to feel less pressure from the refugees that you have taken in. This is an attempt to stabilize the country. But the most important thing here is the government of Syria, the regime, whichever you want to call, clearly doesn't want its refugees back. So there's a big problem in terms of that first issue, refugee returns. Reconciliation is a term that, again, the Russians have used for the process of acquiring territory from the opposition through surrender. The term reconciliation in Syria now is affiliated with a process of siege and starve or reconcile. And thus, reconciliation more often means you have to provide all of your sons and probably your husband to the military, who will get shipped off to fight against his former friends or partners in the opposition, provided that you had no previous involvement in opposition activity, in which case you probably have little of a life in reconciled areas. So similarly, reconciliation has little to go for it right now. And frankly speaking, the idea of constitutional reform and elections seems to me a very long time away. Although the UN seems to think we're at an imminent stage of agreeing a new Syrian constitution, and eventually, I keep hearing, holding elections. So we'll see where that goes. So I think I've explained a number of the things that lie on the rest of the slide. I've been given my 2-minute warning, so I'll try and sum up. But essentially, where we are right now is Russia feels like it's won. The regime knows it's won. Iran certainly knows that it has won its strategic victory in Syria, and that's a whole other subject which Ilan will probably come on to. But Russia is trying to pivot the international discussion from the military conflict to politics and to negotiations. Their line is, okay, behind the scenes, okay, we get it. You don't care all that much about continuing to determine the future of Syria. So let's talk, let's get a settlement, let's stabilize Syria. Oh, and by the way, we want, you to invest in reconstructing our mess. My fear is, as ridiculous as a lot of that sounds, and there won't be progress on the reconstruction funding, but in terms of saying, okay, let's come to the table, let's talk about the settlement, my fear is we are actually treading down on that path. A whole number of European states are already quietly re-engaging with the regime through direct and indirect channels, and even in the United States, there have been a number of indications I've been given recently that that's our primary focus now. Apart from defeating ISIS, our primary focus is re-energizing Geneva and coming to a settlement under Russian and UN auspices. So that's basically the trajectory we're on. Why do I highlight that with the cynicism that I do? It's going to lead to a sense, my last line here, of short to medium term stability. We're all feeling relieved that there aren't fleets of tanks firing against each other across fields, barrel bombs and ballistic missiles firing off in all directions. That is all well and good in the short to medium term. But the recipe of the things that I've been describing so far, I hope, is that the root causes of the conflict, the reason why people originally picked up a gun or took to the streets with roses in March, April, and May 2011 to call for political reform, not regime overthrow, they remain not just the same, but even worse. And if refugees don't have a hope of returning, and if the solution to the conflict is a scorched earth strategy, as we're almost certainly going to see in Idlib any day soon, what hope do we have of seeing a sort of reunited, settled Syria where there is a negotiated process that includes a component of a meaningful political, civil opposition? I don't think we have much hope of that right now. So I'm concerned, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions you have afterwards.
Thank you, Charles, for this comprehensive and clear presentation. And I know that we have a lot to say, but I hope that we'll have at least half an hour or 40 minutes for question and answers and comments. I just saw that we have a gap in this panel because we don't have any representative or any panelists which speak about the Damascus regime. And I think this is not my area directly, but of the institute, that we didn't introduce somebody which will speak about Bashar al-Assad and his regime. But because we don't have the Assad regime represented, we have its patrons, Russia, because today, clearly Russia is the patron and the power broker, and not only in Syria, but because they're a stronghold, military and strategic in Syria, they have developed during the last 2-3 years a comprehensive strategy of returning to the Middle East as a global power, and it happens in Egypt, in Libya, even in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So we have now to speak about the Russian influence or the Russian Middle Eastern perspective, if you want. Dr. Yaacov Falkov, which is founding director of the Institute for National Security and Counter-Terrorism, and professor of law, public administration, and international affairs at the Syracuse University in the United States. He's also a research fellow at our institute, ICT, and is teaching at IDC. He's a visiting lecturer at Tel Aviv University and also a research fellow at the University of Oxford. He holds a PhD in history and an MA in security and diplomacy from the Tel Aviv University. And he has written a monograph, Forest Spies, the Intelligence Activity of the Soviet Partisans, which is not about the negative partisans in Syria, but more about those positive partisans during the Second World War. So, Yaacov, please.
Thank you very much for Dr. Karmon for this presentation. I only would like to mention that the first two titles were not mine, but the rest is okay about me. I was asked today to present the Russian logics for coming to Syria and for being involved in the Middle Eastern region at all. So I would start actually with this slide, which shows us actually the scope of the reasons that we are talking here. Actually, not about one single reason or a few reasons, but a system of reasons, different reasons, interconnected between them, that all of them together bring the Russians to the Middle East and specifically to Syria. Oh, excuse me. We are talking about the internal challenges. We are talking about the security reasons. We are talking, of course, about the geopolitics, about economy, and finally, about the ideology. We have no much time to elaborate about each one of them, but nonetheless, I will try to describe them shortly. So let's start from the internal reasons. We all know that the Russians have enough internal problems, and we've seen them during the last years. Very brightly, the protest channels closing inside Russia. They have multiple economic problems in the Russian economy. They do have those people who visited Russia and traveled outside Moscow, probably witnessed the stagnating periphery in Russia, and not only in remote areas like Caucasus or Ural and other places, but also near Moscow, near St. Petersburg. Of course, they have growing social insecurity, immobility, and inequality. And very Russian traditional answer for not many decades, but even centuries, was and still is to try to relocate the focus of the local citizens from the internal problems to the outside security issues, to create a kind of small conflict outside the Russian territory, to win a kind of a small war very successfully, and those to convince the local citizens, the Russian people, that they still have very powerful and very capable leadership inside Russia. So in the case of Syria, we actually have seen the same attempt of the Russian regime to relocate the refocus the local citizens, the local people, from the internal problems to the outside problems in Syria. Here we are talking about the geopolitics. In terms of geopolitics, Russia is trying, since the downfall of the Soviet Union, since in 1991, to restore its status of a superpower. She works very hard to do this in different areas, and here finally she had this opportunity to remind the outside world that she is still a superpower, that she is capable of relocating her forces from Russia to the outside remote regions like the Middle East. And of course, she's trying, because of lack of intervention of the West. It was quite easy for Russia to actually to do this because, as we've heard previously, the Americans didn't want to intervene massively. So it was also the opportunity to show the outside world and also, again, the local citizens in Russia that we are much more capable than the Americans. We are able to bring our forces outside to the Middle East and to win the local war and to influence the local situation. And of course, they were trying to take the competitors' attention from much nearer conflicts to the Russian territory, from Ukraine, mainly from Ukraine, but also from the tension with the Baltic states, from their tensions with Poland and other states. And it was very good opportunity to them for doing this. Again, vis-a-vis the West, we are talking about a kind of preparation, as far as the Russians see this, a kind of preparation for much bigger deal, not only in Syria and not only in the Middle East, but they are trying to rearrange their relationships with the West and mainly with the United States. So it was a very good platform to use, I mean the Syrian platform, to use this conflict and their achievements, their remarkable achievements in Syria, to approach or reapproach the West and the United States and to try to make a much bigger deal, which will allow them to restart their relationships with the United States. And last but not least, we are talking also about the local, regional superpowers, mainly Iran and Turkey, which still have very significant influence not only inside Russia on the local Muslim population, but also in the entire region of the former Soviet Union. It is very important to the Russians to come here and to try to deal with those local superpowers in order to contain their activity in the former Soviet Union and Russia itself. Here we are witnessing the security reasons, which again are multiple. The counter-terrorism reason was already mentioned by previous speakers. It is very important. The big presence, the very significant presence of the people whom Russians describe as terrorists, the Muslim fighters who came here to Syria and to our region at all, from not only from Russia, but from the entire former Soviet Union, from the Central Asia and other places. And they pose, in the Russian eyes, they posed and still pose very significant threat to the Russian security, and the Russians are trying to deal with this threat here in this region and not to allow them to come here to the Russian territory. But again, all things connected to the so-called Arab Spring, which Russians obviously didn't like because of possible influence of these events on the internal Russian security. So in their eyes, they should have come here in order to be able to handle this situation in the region, in situ, in the place. And of course, the biggest, much bigger security or military issues are the presence, very massive presence of the Western forces in our region, in the Mediterranean, in Turkey, in the Persian Gulf, which in the Russian eyes, again, poses very significant threat on their security. So they felt obliged to come here and to deal with this threat here in our region. And of course, it was very nice opportunity for them to try their new weaponry, their new warfare doctrines, to learn about the weaponry and doctrines of the rivalries, and firstly and foremost of the West, and to promote the export, of course, of the weapons, and not only to the region but worldwide. Speaking about the economy and the export of the region, our region is very important to the Russians, not only because of the armament export, but they're also getting the agricultural import mainly from Turkey, but also from Egypt and other countries, which is very important to the local Russian market. They're also trying to sell different foods, for example, the halal meat to the local countries. The energy competition, they have to deal with Saudi Arabia and other very important players in the oil and gas fields, and Israel too, lastly, which actually has very good a big amount of natural gas. So they are trying to come here and to deal with Israel too. And infrastructure is building. The previous speaker told about their attempt, the Russian attempt, to bring here investments. So they are thinking about possible use of those investments for their purposes, to take this money and to channel it to the Russian, to the different Russian entities and players. And of course, last but again not least, the knowledge acquisition mainly from Israel. Israel is seen by the Russians as a very important source of modern technologies that they are trying, military, but not only military, and other technologies, and they are trying to acquire those technologies and to use them for enhancing the capabilities of the Russian economy. And here we are also witnessing this importance of a Russian patronage for the local Christian communities and for the local holy places in Jerusalem and other places, not only in Israel, but also in Syria, in Jordan, and etc. So the Russian regime uses this patronage as a kind of geopolitical diplomatic tool, not only vis-à-vis our region, but worldwide in its relationships with Christian, with Orthodox communities in countries like Greece. So its presence here and its capability to influence the local holy places here in our region and in Israel is very important as a geopolitical tool for Russia. We are also talking, because of the very big number of Muslims in Russia itself, we are talking about enabling the Hajj, the yearly pilgrimage to Mecca by the Russian Muslims. And it is very important because of the growing number of people who want to visit those holy places in Saudi Arabia. It is very important for the Russians to secure those routes of pilgrimage from Russia to the Middle East. And of course, we are talking about a kind of export of an anti-Western ideology, which has been developed by the Russian regime during the last decades, and they're trying to replace, to a kind of sell this model, non-Western model of ruling to the local regimes, which means we are bringing you arms, we are bringing you even a kind of economic development, infrastructural development, without democracy and without real liberalism. And it is very important in their eyes, and Moscow tries to use again this new ideology as a kind of international or diplomatic tool. And finally, a few words about the tools for promoting this policy. The Russians, they very like a systemic, they call it a systemic approach or holistic approach. They are trying to use multiple tools simultaneously, and I think they are quite good in doing this. They are using not only diplomacy, but also the military force. They're using the economy tools that they do possess, and of course the soft power, mainly different TV channels like Russia Today, which broadcasts also in Arabic language. When we are talking about diplomacy, just to stress a few things, we are not talking only about professional diplomats. We are talking also about the military diplomacy. We are talking about the intelligence diplomacy. We are talking even about the diplomacy by those religious guys, leaders of the religious groups in Russia, etc., etc. Of course, Mr. Patrushev, the head of the State Security Council, is very active person in our region and also outside. While talking about the military force, we are talking not only about Russia's official military men, but we are talking also about a force like the Wagner, the infamous Wagner group, mercenaries who come to our region, and also recently we've heard about Africa too. They are very active there. So, speaking about the partisans, it was mentioned previously that I've recently published a book about the Soviet partisans during World War II. So the Russians are still very good in using this kind of hybrid warfare, putting together the conventional forces and also unconventional irregular forces. And they are doing this by supplementing Iranian and different Shia forces in Syria, by using and cooperating with Hezbollah, and of course by bringing their own irregular forces, so-called mercenaries from Russia and those who fought previously in Ukraine, by bringing them here. And again, economy, they're trying, I've already said, they're trying to sell as much arms as possible, and at least according to their own claims, they are quite successful in this. But they are trying also to sell, for example, the nuclear plants and other things that they are capable of bringing here for building infrastructures, for example, as I already said previously. And the soft power, I've already mentioned these different channels, different influence groups. They are also using different cyber operations for promoting the information useful for the Moscow regime, and etc., etc. I will skip this. And to conclude, I would say that the Russians, and it is quite obviously now, the Russians are here to stay. Till now, they were quite successful in pacifying, at least on their terms, the Syrian territory. They are trying to enlarge their influence and to embrace the entire region, but at least to my opinion, they do understand that they are incapable of creating a kind of Pax Russica. They do not want to be involved in everything that happens in our region. They do not want to be in charge, to pay for everything. They are trying to arrange a series of small local deals with different players, with the Iranians, with the Syrians, even with the Israelis and the Saudis. And they are trying to leverage these small deals and their success in Syria again to come to the West, to the United States, and to close much bigger deal, which will include not only Syria but also Ukraine and the entire situation inside Russia, non-intervention of the West in the internal Russian affairs, non-intervention of the West in the, they do call it the close abroad, which means Ukraine, Belarus, and even the Baltic countries, etc., etc. So again, they will try to stay here, to enlarge their influence, and to use this presence to close much bigger deal with the West. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yaacov. I think that during the question and answers, we have to speak a bit about what's Pax Russica here. But we'll have now an expert on the Iranian issue, but also on the American issue. And here, Mr. Ilan Berman has a schizophrenic task because we asked him to speak about Iran and the United States. So I understand it's a bit difficult at this moment. And I don't know if we'll begin with Iran or with the United States, because when I decided the order of the panelists, I thought Russia is very important because for the moment they are really the power brokers on the ground. But at the same time, we know the huge importance of the Iranians. And the United States is in a very awkward position. The Obama administration has retreated from the region practically. Trump has declared not long ago that he wants to leave Syria, or the United States to leave Syria. So we're not yet sure where we stand. So we hope that Ilan will give some insights. Ilan is an expert on regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. He has consulted both the CIA and the United States Department of Defense. He is vice president of the American Foreign Policy Council, AFPC, and he is also a member of the associate faculty at Missouri State University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies. He edited 4 books, and he is author of 4 books, most of them about Iran, and his most recent book is Iran's Deadly Ambition, the Islamic Republic's Quest for Global Power. Ilan.
So thank you, Ali. And let's just be clear. I may be an expert on Iran, but I'm far from an expert on U.S. politics. So as I think all of us are kind of in a gray zone at the moment. But thank you. This is not my first rodeo, as they say, at ICT. This is, I think, my 5th year. But it's always nice to come back. It's always nice to have these sort of intellectual and very stimulating conversations, particularly when you're coming, like I am, from Washington, where policy conversations never really end. They just go round and round. It's always nice to hear other perspectives. Let me start. Like Charles, I'm not a fan of PowerPoint. You're going to see a PowerPoint. Please forgive me. I do not have my PhD in PowerPoint, like some of my colleagues. This is mostly, as an absent-minded professor, this is mostly just for my sort of reference. But especially in the case of Iranian strategy in Syria, a picture really is worth 1,000 words, and a map is actually worth even more. So I've tried to select some maps that'll really give you a sense, a flavor of what I'm talking about. And lastly, Eli did ask me a very schizophrenic sort of task, and I told him before that I will do Iran.
Steve is possible.
Yeah, no, sorry, but I will do Iranian strategy in Syria and American strategy in Syria, and there will be 19 minutes on Iranian strategy and 1 minute on American strategy, because I think that's probably the balance in terms of importance, relative importance. I spent a lot of time working on Iran, and so I want to start with the genesis, the engine of a lot, not all, but a lot of what is propelling Iran's activity in the region currently. And this isn't a conversation about Iran's nuclear program, but there's a very direct correlation with the 2015 nuclear deal that was struck between the P5+1 countries and Iran Iran's current level of activism regionally. The best way, that's the simplest way you can describe it, is that the 2015 nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, was intended to be tactical in nature, right, to deal with only one aspect of the Iranian threat, the nuclear program. And the Obama administration made very clear that this was not supposed to be a grand bargain or a comprehensive solution, even though quietly they wished it would be. But the reality is that the benefits that accrued to Iran as a result of that deal were strategic in nature. They were so large as to be transformative for Iran's strategic horizons and also Iran's capability to project power regionally. And what we're talking about here is not only the more than $100 billion in previously escrowed oil revenue. And remember, this isn't American taxpayer dollars. This is revenue generated by Iranian foreign oil sales that were frozen in foreign jurisdictions in response to requests by the US government. That, as part of the sweetener that the Iranians received in negotiating with the West over the nuclear program, were liberated. Iran was able to access them. There's an interesting conversation to be had here about exactly how much money they've repatriated into Iran, because if you check the news before you walked in here, you would know that the Iranian rial is now trading at 150,000 to $1 US. So the Iranians haven't taken all that money back because they don't want it to be devalued in the Iranian national economy. But nonetheless, it's a chunk of change, as we say. And it is dwarfed, actually, by the level and the volume of post-sanctions trade that Iran experienced in its interactions with countries like Japan and India and China and Russia as a result of a relaxation of U.S. pressure on these potential trading partners for Iran in the 2 years that followed the signing of the JCPOA. And what ended up happening was that the JCPOA served as a gateway of sorts, a gateway for Iran to realize something they had talked about for a long time, which is the expansion of Iranian borders, or if not borders, the expansion of Iranian strategic influence far beyond territorial Islamic Republic of Iran. So it's not an exaggeration, I think, to talk about an incipient Iranian empire. And in fact, if you listen to Iranian officials talk about it, this is precisely the terms that they talk about. They talk about a manifest destiny. They talk about Iran being at least a regional hegemon. And it looks a little something like this. The JCPOA has facilitated, so this map is not exactly accurate. I couldn't quite find exactly what I was looking for, but it gives you a flavor of what we're talking about. As a result of this more permissive strategic atmosphere that Iran now has, up until just a few months ago. The Islamic Republic now has a contiguous line of territorial control stretching from Western Afghanistan all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean as a result of a confluence of factors, as a result of a weak Afghan security environment to Iran's east, as a result of the presence and preponderant weight of Shiite militias in the Iraqi body politic that are very subservient to Iran. These militias now, by the way, are not free-floating entities. They have been grandfathered into the Ministry of the Interior. So Iran has, in a very real sense, a foothold into government decision-making in Iraq. This has been accomplished by an intrusion of Iranian forces, both regime forces and Iranian-supported irregulars into the Syrian space, and through an expansion and an activation of Hezbollah in Lebanon, right? And that takes you all the way to the Eastern Mediterranean. So here's an interesting question. What does an empire require? Right? If you look at the broad sweep of history, there's lots of answers you could give to this, but what you really come down to is two things. An empire requires supply lines, and an empire requires people to enforce the empire. And the Iranians have spent the last 2.5 years, longer actually, but in earnest the last 2.5 years, building exactly those conduits. So when we talk about supply lines, we're talking about a land bridge, Iranian corridors of transport through which material and personnel have flowed from territorial Iran through Iraq into the Syrian theater. And we're talking about an air bridge, the transport of Iranian soldiers and Iranian-sponsored irregulars from Iran, sometimes in a circuitous route through the south of Iran, into the Syrian theater. By the way, the airline most responsible, and you can sort of see that in the last picture, is Iran Air, the national air carrier of Iran, which, as a result of the JCPOA in 2015, was de-designated by the Obama administration, right? So the Iran Air could do unrestricted international travel. They could buy new equipment and vehicles, and they have used that to strategic effect. By the way, Iran Air, the slogan of Iran Air, right? Every good company has a slogan. The slogan of Iran Air is, I kid you not, our mission is your safety, which I might take a little bit of issue with, seeing what they've been doing in the Syrian theater, but nonetheless, this is an air bridge that's actually beginning to be rolled back now, because as part of the first tranche of sanctions that have been reimposed by the Trump administration, Iran Air has been redesignated. And so there is at least a slowdown in this flow currently. But this was the situation that existed for a very long time. The second is the question of personnel. And here we call them a lot of things. We call them in Iraq the Popular Mobilization Forces. We call them Shiite militias in Syria. For our purposes, this is a jihadi legion, right? This is a group that has been organized by Iran, comprised of disparate Shiite militias in places like Syria, Shiite irregulars from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Yemen, Iraqi militias that are part of the government that have been mobilized, and many of them have been deployed into the Syrian theater. I'll go back here. The thing to understand about this is that this is, as Charles said, this is a force that dwarfs in number the countervailing forces against which it's arrayed. So the back of the envelope calculation that the Soufan Center, a New York-based counterterrorism think tank, made in their study in fall of last year was that roughly 40,000 foreign fighters from all over, from 82 separate countries, have flowed into the Syria and Iraq space from mid-2014 until the end of 2017 when the study was calibrated. And Craig will talk, I think. Maybe those numbers aren't quite accurate. I defer to him, right? I'm just sort of basing on that study. The US intelligence community estimates that an analogous number of foreign fighters that are Shiite, that have been organized by Iran, have been mobilized and deployed as a countervailing force. The Israeli government is a little bit more coy about how it estimates these things, but if you really press Israeli officials hard, they'll tell you somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 foreign fighters. And if you ask private sector experts, like my friend Nader Uskawi from the Washington Institute, who just is publishing a book on this, what he would say is that if you rack and stack the Shiite militias and you include not only active duty deployed foreign fighters, but also potential reserve forces drawn from the Iranian Basij and others, what you're looking at is something closer to 150,000, right? Just by way of comparison, 160,000 is the standing army of the Kingdom of Morocco. 200,000 is the standing army of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, right? So we're talking about a large, consolidated entity. And the worry that we have, that we don't have with foreign fighters that have joined the Islamic State, is the Islamic State foreign fighters are self-organized. We worry about returnee fighters. We worry about the caliphate crumbling and these guys returning to their countries of origin or moving on to other theaters of jihad. But this is a sort of a rats leaving a sinking ship problem, if you will. With the Shiite countervailing contingent, we're worried about these organized troops being sent elsewhere by an organizing entity, right? So we're talking about Iran prioritizing Syria now, but maybe in the future prioritizing someplace like Yemen, and with very important strategic effects. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Iranian strategy in Syria. And what I would argue is that it's essentially a three-pronged strategy. The first strategy is a very basic and obvious one. It is a preservation of the Assad regime, which the Iranian leadership sees as, despite all of the sort of sectarian differences, sees as an essential and intrinsic part of the Islamic Republic. And if you go in the open source, you can see lots of statements by Iranian officials then and now talking about Syrian security being an essential part of the security of the Islamic Republic, right? This is what we call strategic depth. Iran views Syria as strategic depth from incursions from the United States and the West. This has meant that Iran has needed to preserve what historically has been called Alawistan, right? So this is a great look at sort of the sectarian divisions of the Syrian conflict. It's not exactly up to date, but it gives you a good sense of the dark red strip, right, the Alawistan, the Alawite enclave of Syria, where Bashar al-Assad has drawn his base of support. And Iran's strategic presence has surrounded Alawite enclaves, right? The map did not transfer over. Let me see. Has surrounded the Alawite enclaves in a very real sense. And like Russia's, is designed to protect the Assad regime and the core base of support that the Assad regime enjoys from this population. Let me see if I can go back. Okay. So second prong of Iranian strategy is demographic in nature. And it has to do with not only bolstering the demographics in Syria, but also, if you could use the word, terraforming them, sort of making it a more hospitable environment for not only for the Assad regime itself, but for Iran and its proxies. So the numbers, very basically, and I think you guys all know them, before the war, the total population of Syria was 21 million people. Right now, half of that population is displaced, either internally or externally. You are looking at roughly 12 million people who have remained in Syria proper. Currently, they've moved around. They've obviously left Aleppo and Homs and other places, but they remain in the country. But the real question here is, who has stayed and who has left, right? Who's leaving? It's not the Alawites, because the Alawites understand very well that remaining and fighting for the status quo is the greatest guarantor of their security. And as a result, when you had 10% Alawite, roughly, before the start of the war, that proportion has increased, right? And people differ on the numbers, but the estimates that I've heard range anywhere from 25% to 30% of the population that has remained now, right? So when Bashar al-Assad makes his statements talking about how he is a legitimate president, right, we can laugh, but he's looking at the demographic numbers, and he's certainly a more legitimate president now, demographically, than he was before. Right? So there's a certain twisted logic to what he's saying. And the Iranians are reinforcing this presence through a demographic amplification of Shiite representation. Right? And they don't have a lot to work with, right? The indigenous Shiite population, not Alawite, but Shiite population of Syria is somewhere between 5 and 8%. It's not a lot to work with. But what you have seen, and what the US intelligence community has seen, is this steady accretion of Shiite non-combatants that have accompanied the influx of Shiite fighters, right? So you see the building of, let me see if I can find these, I'm sorry, these maps are not great. Yeah, okay, so you see the building of civilian facilities surrounding, proximate to military bases where Iran has set up shop, or training garrisons where Iranian-supported Shiite irregulars have set up shop. Right? And I think it's too early to measure the actual impact that this demographic bolstering has, but it's very clear that it's part of a larger coordinated strategy. And whether it's a freestanding strategy or whether it's simply intended to support the Assad regime, right now it's not possible to know. But it is clear that Iran is thinking more broadly about the demographics and the future demographics of Syria than we tend to give them credit for. And so what's the end state here? And people are sort of thinking very deeply about this. There's a great article published just a couple of days ago, I believe it was for the Middle East Institute, by Mona Alami of the Washington Institute, in which she talked about the Lebanonization of Syria, how Iran is essentially pursuing the Lebanese model, the model by which it established Hezbollah and allowed Hezbollah to entrench itself and to co-opt the indigenous population in the south of Lebanon, and how it's transposing that model into Syria, right? And I think some of her conclusions bear reciting here, right? Alami writes, if Lebanese history has taught us anything, Iranian retreat from southwest Syria will be short-lived. It will be more a tactical maneuver by the IRGC to ease tension and consolidate gains rather than a permanent retreat. While southwest Syria may not be Iran's immediate concern, it is unlikely that it will forego such an essential card. It is likely that given its Lebanese success, Iran will apply a similar blueprint in Syria. Tehran will also want to extend what Hezbollah has on its Lebanese frontier with Israel to the Golan and leverage southwest Syria in its confrontation with Israel in the long run. Iran is trying to shape its strategic interests in Syria as time passes to maintain its land bridge there against Israel, right? And this is the strategic picture that Israeli policymakers are looking at when they look north. And I think Charles's admonition that it's way too early to breathe a sigh of relief is germane in the context of the constellation of Sunni forces that's fighting in Syria, but it's particularly true in the Iranian equation, because the Iranian equation is changing, and it's changing not against Iran, it's actually changing in Iran's favor. And that gets us to players in the Syria space. And I promise to talk about the United States. I can't only talk about the United States because I think you have to understand what America is doing or not doing in the context of this balancing that you see the Trump administration pursuing. So we have Iranian objectives, which I tried to lay out for you guys at a 30,000-foot level. We also have Russian objectives, and Yaakov's presentation, I think, was terrific in spelling out. I would dumb it down to essentially three things. I would say Iran wants to preserve its military basing. It had, since the 1970s, it had a standing maritime presence. The Soviet and Russian Mediterranean flotilla was based out of Tartus. When Assad was not doing well, the Russians were worried they were going to lose. This shaped their intervention into Syria and their deployments thereafter. And so they've bolstered that presence in Tartus. They've reinforced it with an air base at Khmeimim. When Russia talks about having the run of the country, this doesn't mean that Russia's based all over the country. Russia's actually based along the Alawite corridor. It's doing operations around the country. But the presence that they're trying to reinforce is that. And so right now, Russia is in a qualitatively better strategic position than it was in 2011. Russia wants to shore up support for Assad because Russia knows that any political configuration, and by the way, I tend to agree. I don't know that the preservation of Bashar al-Assad, the person, is the hill that the Russian leadership is going to die on. I think a political constellation of forces that preserve these strategic interests for Russia, even if it means Assad leaving, I think the Kremlin would be fine with it. But they need that sort of access. And what they want, because, as Yaacov pointed out, they're having difficulties at home, is they want other stakeholders in the mix. So simply put, Russia wants to stay, but it doesn't want to pay. And so it's trying to build an international coalition to involve the Europeans and also to involve the Trump administration. And this is sort of where American strategy comes in. Now, I have found, right, we are all living in a Trumpian world and we're all sort of watching US foreign policy. I have found that a very good litmus test or a predictor of what's going to happen is to look at the president's campaign promises. Right? One thing he's been very consistent about is to satisfy his campaign promises. And on foreign policy, remember, he wasn't a foreign policy candidate. On foreign policy, he essentially had three things. He said that he was going to bomb the expletive out of ISIS, right? Which parenthetically is not a strategy, but it makes for a nice T-shirt because I saw them in Cleveland at the convention. It was very nice. Which he has done very successfully, right? Building on the early successes of the Obama administration, he has amplified the global coalition to counter ISIS, I think, in a very constructive way. He, on the campaign trail, spent a lot of time talking about deconflicting relations with Russia. Now, this is obviously an enormously politically sensitive conversation, but it does bring to mind the fact that some sort of accommodation between Washington and Moscow over Syria will go at least some of the way towards normalizing what is right now a very fraught diplomatic relationship. And the third is, and this is, I think, a little bit apart, is that to get out of the Iran deal and to reimpose containment against Iran. And here, the Trump administration has done a lot. And the litmus test, the orienting point for all this, I think, is the May speech by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo at the Heritage Foundation, where he laid out the 12 demands that the Trump administration has as a prerequisite for normalization with Iran, normalization of relations with Iran. Set aside for the fact that for Iran, which is an ideological revolutionary regime, satisfying those criteria are, frankly, probably impossible because it would fundamentally undermine their legitimacy. They nonetheless provide important barometers about what the United States wants to see accomplished with regard to Iran policy. And one of the prongs, which bears noting in this context, is that the Trump administration, as a precursor to a lessening of sanctions pressure against Iran, has said that Iran must remove its military personnel from southern Syria. I think they said all of Syria, but the reality is southern Syria. And so there's two questions to be had here, right? For a long time, I think the Trump administration believed that Russia could accomplish this, which would reinforce that second prong of having Russia sort of be a constructive actor. I think taking the rose-colored glasses off is useful sooner rather than later. So it's nice that the Russians have told us that they actually can't do this. But I think that there were at least some people in the White House that were counting on a more robust Russian intervention to push the Iranians out. But the other factor is this actually really does nothing or very little to alter Iranian strategy in Syria, because the language of the Pompeo statement is that Iran must remove its military personnel. But as study after study, and I second Charles's point, the Omran Center, based out of Istanbul, is a fantastic resource. They did a study a couple of months ago laying out the soft power strategy that Iran is pursuing in Syria, right? Everything from building schools to setting up branches for Islamic education in local universities, right? Everything that runs the gamut that guarantees that even if Iran's military presence leaves southern Syria, Iran's intellectual presence remains. And it remains in a more fertile demographic environment, right? And that creates a problem that even if the letter of the Trump demand is met, the spirit of the Trump demand is not being met. And so these are sort of the harsh realities that the United States government is trying to deal with. And I'm a firm believer in the notion that personnel is policy. So I've been enormously heartened by the fact that some really good people have been appointed of late to be special envoy for Syrian engagement. But all of these are political posts. They're intended to create a political settlement in Syria. And under the current constellation of forces, that political settlement in Syria is going to benefit Russia, certainly, but I would argue very likely it's going to benefit Iran as well. So I'll stop there. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ilan, for managing to present so difficult and contrasting subjects in a short time. I'm happy to have among us Dr. Colonel Rateb Amro, which is Director General and Founder at the Horizon Strategic Studies in Jordan, Amman. He's also served as the director of the occupied territories in the Jordanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs during the years 87-95, and he served as a colonel in Jordan's armed forces. He has a PhD in political science from Ain Shams University in Egypt, and he has written a lot about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And I think it's very important that we have somebody from the Arab world which will speak about Jordan, but also perhaps about the other Arab players in the Syrian conflict.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, everybody. I'm so glad to be here talking to these selected people. I'm trying to be short, actually. I'm going to talk about the overview of the challenge, Syrian challenge to Jordan. The Syrian civil war, as all of you know, by most accounts, the Syrian civil war is slowly winding down. And its final chapter is already being written, but there will not be a clean-cut conclusion to the bloody conflict that has claimed the lives of almost 500,000, displaced 10 million, and destroyed at least 1/3 of the country since 2011. The Syrian civil war aggravated into an untransparent conflict in terms of players, level of violence, victims, and an increasing number of refugees. Especially Jordan is facing a huge influx of Syrian refugees, which poses significant socio-economic political and security challenge to the country. The world cannot accept to go back to pre-uprising Syria while ignoring the fact that war crimes and human rights abuse have been committed. This is a comprehensive political process, one that seeks nation reconciliation and wider political participation is urgently needed. This is where Moscow, as the key stakeholder, must present guarantees and commitment to the international community, but that is not all. There would have to be an independent investigation into the role many parties have played in facilitating the inflow of foreign jihadists and in providing arms to rebel groups. About the Jordanian-Syrian relations, as you know, Jordan-Syrian relations are no exception. All along, they escalated between good and bad times, but the territorial imperative, the reality that we are permanent neighbors, dictates that no amount of disagreement between government could ever sever the human factor in our relations. This is why so many Syrians have crossed into Jordan since the war broke out there 7 years ago, and have remained ever since. Figures vary between 1 and 1.5 million Syrians in Jordan right now. The war in Syria is about to end. The southern part of the country, including the Nasib crossing, is now under official Syrian control, which means that the border will soon reopen to normal traffic. This is a great step for both sides, Jordan and Syria. Furthermore, Jordan has expressed its desire to reopen the borders with Syria for commercial and passenger traffic once the highway to Damascus has been secured. Russia would want to show to the regime is being recognized by its neighbor, while for Jordan, reopening the border would give its waning economy an important push. What is the Russian role in Syria? Russia, an ally for both Syria and Israel, might find much interest in shaping a regional settlements between the regional parties. Moreover, limited clashes on the borders between Israel and Syria are expected to go on. Russia, which managed to play the role of guarantee the situation in the south, will find itself obliged to keep playing this role on a bigger scale. The achievement of the South deal between Israel and Syria will logically lead to a further reconciliation stage. What about the Iranian presence in Syria? The Iranian presence in Syria is not only problematic for Jordan and the other neighbors. It might also represent a problem for the Syrian government, as the phase of the risk that requires the Iranian physical presence is over. The Syrian government will logically adopt to a pragmatic political approach that will help central government of Damascus contain all triggers on any possible coming uprising. On an internal level, the Syrian government is expected to launch a phase of reconciliation. On the regional level, the Iranian presence in the wall of Syria, not just in the south, will be subject to more pressure on Damascus. Syria realized that, at the end, internal reconciliation is key of launching a political solution. Therefore, the Syrian priorities will logically change. Besides that, Syrians believe that Russia is the only side that can shape a solution on the international level, while Iran might represent a strong burden on the same level. The impact to Jordan. The Kingdom of Jordan, lying on Syria's southern flank, has been less beset by political violence than Lebanon or Turkey. The fighting in the south of Syria has been expected for some time and could be the final chapter of the ongoing crisis there. Jordan continues to face multi-dimensional risk for the refugees to security and the danger of continuous military confirmation on the borders. Moreover, it is important to realize that Russian achievement of a ceasefire deal in the south of Syria has actually helped Jordan avoid various risky scenarios. What we should do in Jordan. The military and political response, while the security implications are serious, they also cannot manage long term without a political solution. Throughout the Syrian crisis, Jordan's military and security forces have played a major role in preventing it from crossing the borders. The risk on the border is still on the major concerns of all stakeholders, especially neighboring countries. Jordan should have anticipated this situation and prepared a strategy to minimize these risks. As it facing the consequence and impact on the situation in Syria alone, the 380 kilometers of border, it is not a permanent one. The security and military approach cannot be criticized, and it has managed to protect Jordan from the potential negative impact from the ongoing crisis. However, in order to guarantee security into the longer term and maintain stability in the region, a flexible approach is required to bring balance and peace to the borders, while also creating new economic opportunities to build a new future for Jordan. Finally, the Jordanian military is a source of assurance for all interested parties. Jordan will only reopen the border when there could be an agreement between the two official armies, and the Syrians actually control the other side. They understand the importance of having the south of Syria back under the official control of Damascus. This win-win outcome can only be achieved through a compromise deal between Jordan, Russia, and USA on our side, and Israel, Russia, and the USA on the other side of the border. This deal would manage the risks and create a settlement that could lead to wider regional settlements in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Amro. Dr. Amro has participated on at several conferences at ICT, and we are glad to have him here because in many senses, Jordan and Israel have suffered the main threats. Until recently, the ISIS threat from southern Syria was not only on Israel, but also on Jordan, and also possibly the future threat of Iran. If they continue to be active in southern Syria, even with their militias, is also a common threat between Jordan and Israel. Charles spoke about the problem of solving the Syrian conflict, how difficult it will be on the short and the medium term. I used to, in the last presentations, to speak about the fact that there is no solution and stability in the region as long as the Sunnis between Baghdad and Damascus do not have a fair solution to their problems. And in this sense, the issue of stability in Syria is quite closely connected with the stability in Iraq, and we know that Iraq also is not quite a stable state, especially after the last elections and the very unclear situation that it provoked. So on the Iraqi perspective, we have another panelist, Ms. Lydia Khalil. She is a research fellow at the West Asia program at the Lowy Institute in Australia. Lydia has a broad range of policy, academic, and private sector experience, focusing on the intersection between governance and security. She served as a political advisor for the US Department of Defense in Iraq. She was most recently a senior advisor to the Boston Police Department, and in the past also to the New York Police Department. Lydia holds a BA International Relations from Boston College and a Master's in International Security from Georgetown University. Lydia, please.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's my first time here at the ICT conference, so I'm very happy to be here with a very distinguished panel. As I mentioned, I'm coming from Australia, so I'm still a little bit loopy from jet lag, so I'll blame that on any mistakes or uninteresting bits of the presentation. So as we've heard from a lot of the other excellent speakers on the panel, the Syrian war, it's not just about a war against the Islamic State. It's not just about a war that the Assad regime is fighting to regain control of the territory and over various rebel factions. It's all of these things, but Syria is also at an intersection of a number of national, subnational, transnational, and geopolitical rivalries that, unfortunately, in the process, have utterly destroyed Syria and have complicated the broader effort of building peace and stability in the region. I tried to get a graphic that explained all of the international players, and unfortunately, this was the best that I could come up with. So my task here is to offer you the Iraqi perspective in the Syrian conflict. Now, Iraq is particularly intertwined with the Syrian conflict, one, because of Daesh. There's still that cross-border nature of the Daesh operations and of the threat. And also, Iraq and Syria are both major theaters of the US coalition and Iran to pursue their own geopolitical interests and played out through their proxies and allied partners there. Again, as many of the other speakers have referenced. I think many of you well know this already, but it would be helpful to review that Daesh originally emerged out of Iraq, formed from the remnants of AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and eventually metastasized into Syria and then bled back into Iraq. So although Daesh started in Iraq, it was only able to take significant territory, Iraqi territory, when it had already established itself in Syria. And it launched attacks into Iraq from its Syrian stronghold. Now, Daesh is no longer a proto-state. Its caliphate has collapsed. Iraq has regained control of the territory under ISIS control, but the ongoing conflict in Syria remains vitally important to the Iraqis. because the Iraqis see it, rightly so, as another front on the same battle that they face at home. The fight against Daesh is obviously far from over, and I think Craig in the next presentation is going to go into what that threat looks like now. But just briefly, I'd say that the remnants remain. The estimates, again, vary widely. I've heard something from a few hundred, which I think is inaccurate, to 30,000, which is also very inaccurate. So who knows what the actual number is, but I would have to agree with Charles and others that it's probably around the 10 to 20,000 mark, depending on how you do the numbers. Now, many of those remnants are concentrated around the Iraq and Syria border, and they continue to carry out attacks from the remote desert region there along the Iraq-Syrian border. Daesh fighters in Mosul in particular have gone to ground and in other areas, and they still carry out sporadic attacks against the Iraqi security forces and civilians. So no one is under any delusion that the Islamic State is a spent force. I think we've learned from our mistakes in 2009 when we thought al-Qaeda in Iraq was a spent force, and we said, well, we have that done and dusted. I think now we're much more attuned to the fact that they could still reemerge. So in addition to the Islamic State threat, you have a number of structural problems in Iraq that the Iraqi state must contend with. And now these are the same structural problems that allowed the rise of the Islamic State to begin with. You have very deep political and sectarian divisions between Iraqi Shias, Sunnis, and Kurds. You have rampant corruption, unemployment, and all of these have not only not gone away in Iraq, despite the fact that they've regained territory from the Islamic State. The ongoing conflict in Syria and the political instability in Iraq has actually exacerbated some of these problems. Because a lot of the resources that should have been spent toward addressing some of those things were directed, well, in the first instance, they were siphoned off through corruption and kickbacks. And in the second instance, were redirected toward fighting the Islamic State that were created out of these problems. So you have this vicious loop of Iraqi structural stability and the fight against terrorism. So because of these divisions that we have in Iraq, these very deep divisions, when we talk about the Syrian conflict from the Iraqi perspective, the first thing that we have to ask is, which one? Which Iraqi perspective? Because we can't really talk about Iraq as one entity or as a unified government. As Ilan mentioned, that the election that happened a few months ago still has not resulted in an official Iraqi government forming. Not only that, but there are protests ongoing in Basra. At the moment, reports just of yesterday of some of those protesters protesting against the lack of services, the high unemployment, and this is in Basra, which is majority Shia and has significant oil wealth. So the new Iraqi government still hasn't been formed to date, and the main impediment to it has been this intense factionalism that has plagued Iraq since the removal of Saddam Hussein. It preceded Saddam Hussein, but his rule kind of put a lid on the boiling pot. And this sectarianism has wreaked havoc in Iraq, and it's made reconstruction and rebuilding extraordinarily difficult. And it's made forging a national Iraqi identity extremely difficult too. And this intensified with the fight against AQI and Daesh, and it hasn't been helped by the neighboring conflict in Syria. So there are a number of ways that the neighboring conflict in Syria, sorry, it's a bit loopy, has exacerbated Iraq's sectarian tensions. It didn't start them, but it has definitely exacerbated them. These tensions were at their height under the former Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. His policies intensified Sunni Arab marginalization in Iraq and grievances. He was very sectarian-minded, and he used de-Baathification laws to target his rivals and install like-minded allies in key positions of government and security. And his period in power particularly emboldened Shia militias in Iraq, and who worked at the behest of the Iraqi government and its Shia factions, and they committed severe human rights abuses. So as an example, if we take how the government treated, Iraqi government under Maliki treated the Sunni Sahwa, or awakening movements. These were Sunni Arab tribal forces made up of about 30 tribes, almost 100,000 fighters, 90 to 100,000 fighters, who mobilized in response to the AQI threat. And this awakening movement, along with US military support, was very successful in rolling back al-Qaeda in Iraq. However, Maliki's government remained very suspicious of them, and despite earlier promises, did not adequately incorporate them into the security structures. He only gave them temporary positions and at lower salaries, and eventually the Maliki government stopped paying Sahwa salaries altogether. At the same time, these Sunni tribes and the Sahwa members who fought against al-Qaeda in Iraq faced an enormous retaliation and pressure campaign from the jihadists in AQI. Almost 1,500 Sahwa members were killed by AQI, and the Maliki government did nothing. So there were also new robust counterterrorism legislations that were put in place after all of this in Iraq, but it was very selectively applied against Sunni political leaders and Sunni Arabs within Iraq. So again, it heightened that sectarianism, fueled the grievances. So when it came to be Syria's turn, and the uprisings resulted in the civil war in Syria and security deteriorated, there was a security vacuum on both sides of the Iraq-Syria border, and Sunni grievances on both sides of the border mixed and allowed those remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq to become the Islamic State. And so the Iraqis, Sunni Arabs, who had their own grievances, became emboldened and inspired by these Syrian rebels who moved against a Shia government that kept them out of power and denied them access to resources, much like the Maliki government did to them in Iraq. So they viewed Maliki and Assad as one and the same, these puppet governments controlled by Iran, who is seeking regional dominance at the expense of Sunni Arabs. So the Iraqi Sunni factions reasoned that if Assad loses Syria, Iran would lose its hold there, and then by extension, it would lose its hold or become weaker in Iraq. And so this stoked the Sunni protests and allowed them to incorporate some of their violent and jihadist factions into their protest movement. So according to the thinking, when Iran loses Syria, that means they'll lose influence here, and the new regime in Syria will be Sunni. So in these provinces, our backs will be protected by the Sunni regime. And so this thinking, spurred by the Syrian conflict, did not help the Sunni Arab cause. Now, 2013-14 is not the same as now. Sunni Arabs in Iraq have mostly come around to this post-Saddam reality in Iraq, and they understand that they're going to have to live with a Shia-dominated government and security forces. And Assad has managed to remain in power, and as we've heard, the rebellion has largely failed. And they've seen Daesh for what it is, and they've disproportionately suffered from Daesh and the Islamic State compared to other forces. But again, unless that there's real reconstruction and resettlement, then this cycle repeat of marginalization and radicalization will continue. Another aspect, I'd say, is sorry, I don't know what's wrong with this, but anyway. Another aspect to the sectarianism in Iraq that's been fueled by Daesh and the Syrian conflict is the emergence of these Hashd al-Shabi militias, or the popular mobilization units. The rise of the Islamic State and their control of Iraqi territory highlighted some severe weaknesses in the Iraqi state and the Iraqi security forces. And these Shia parties and their militias saw an opening. So when Iraqi security forces essentially melted away in the face of the Islamic State threat, these Hashd al-Shabi militias came in. And no doubt they have been a very important bulwark against the Islamic State in Iraq, and they've filled key security gaps. But certainly they haven't been without their controversies. They have very close ties, many of them, and some would say control, by Iran, and this is one of the first concerns. The units, they number at about 120,000. The PMUs are very numerous and diverse, and they're made up of different sects, from Sunni Arab to Christian to Shia, but they are predominantly dominated by pre-existing Shia militia units like the Badr Corps, the Hezbollah brigades, the AAH, the Khorasani brigades, and the Peace brigades. Again, many of them with long-standing ties to Iran, though not all. The leader of the Badr brigade, for example, Hadi al-Amri, and the leader of the Hezbollah brigades, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, they're basically the de facto leaders of these PMUs in the Hashd, and they direct and coordinate many of their activities very closely with Iran. So they played a very key role in liberating and holding territory from Daesh, but they've also, again, been implicated in some serious human rights abuses against Sunni Arabs, and their ties to Iran and their sectarian nature and interests and treatment of Sunni Arabs, they present serious governance concerns that have fueled sectarianism in Iraq. In disputed territories, for example, like Kirkuk and Tel Afar, the Hashd have kind of selectively destroyed property of other sectarian sects, and they prevented the return and carried out extrajudicial killings and generally committed many human rights abuses that, if not checked, will seed future sectarian conflict. And there have been hundreds of these examples that have been well documented in a lot of research from these Hashd militias. Now, the growth of these Hashd militias to address the shortcomings in the Iraqi security forces have resulted in the Shia domination of the Iraqi security forces. And this has been hard for the Iraqi Sunni Arabs to stomach in the past. Remember, under the Ba'ath regime, they were in control of the security sector. So this has been difficult for them to wrap their heads around and to accept. Now, in 2016, Iraq passed a law legalizing these PMUs, or the Hashd, and they granted them the equivalent ranks and salaries of the ISF. Now, by virtue of demographics, the Iraqi security forces in the future are going to be majority Shia, but the point of difference is that they have incorporated these Hashd militias into the ISF wholesale. So, for example, the Badr Brigade was put in as a whole unit and transferred as a whole unit into the Iraqi security services. The Badr Brigade, for example, became almost indistinguishable from the Iraqi Federal Police. The Federal Police was led by a commander from the Badr Brigade. The Federal Police and the Badr militias conducted joint operations, and the security personnel kind of revolved between the two of them. So that's just one example of how their wholesale incorporation into the security forces. On top of that, the Hashd have officially come under ISF control in practice, though they still report to their commanders and pursue their own parochial interest. So in some instances, the Hashd militias have directly contravened ISF orders and clashed with Iraqi government security forces on the ground who've tried to rein them in. And even though they're officially deputized to the ISF, there is this perception that it's not the ISF that's in charge or is in ultimate control. And that's because of the way they were integrated or officially put into the forces. There were these wholesale units, but the history of how they officially became a part of the ISF is an interesting one. Prime Minister Abadi had wanted them to be incorporated into the command chain of the armed forces through the Ministry of Defense. However, that didn't happen. The leaders of the PMU had a different version. What they wanted is for the PMUs to fall under the Prime Minister's office, so essentially creating this Praetorian Guard or National Guard that's under the control of the Prime Minister and not through the official MOD lines. So they have officially become an institutionalized autonomous force. They are in the same parity as the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Interior, and they have a seat at the National Security Council. And this is a very unique stature for these units, and it's allowed them to pursue their interests outside the ISF if they so wish. The other factor is, of course, the Kurds. The Kurds have been indispensable in the fight against the Islamic State. However, they have acted in ways that, again, pursue their pure sectarian interests in a way that have intertwined with the Syrian conflict and have affected Iraqi national unity. They've sought to leverage the conflict in Iraq and Syria in order to ultimately establish the understandable goal, a long-standing goal of the Kurds, of establishing an independent state. But they've done so by unilaterally taking disputed territory in Iraq during their operations against Daesh. And in the chaos, for example, they took control over Kirkuk for a period of time. This was outside of the agreed upon Article 140 process, which mandated a referendum to decide the status of the disputed territories. Now, in 2017, the KRG conducted its own referendum on Kurdish independence, and this was despite being warned by both Baghdad and the United States that such a provocative move would backfire. And indeed it did. It prompted Abadi to send the ISF into Kirkuk, take it back, and it cut off the KRG from funding from Baghdad. Additionally, there's been a flow of Syrian Kurds into the KRG, which has strained the KRG economy and its ability to provide services, and this has fueled further antagonism toward the already very unpopular two main Kurdish parties, the PUK and the KDP. Now, all of this Iraqi factionalism plays out in the other theater of Syria. Syria has become this other theater besides Iraq where the Iraqi factions can play out their battles. Wow, I'm not, okay. So, for example, the Hasht units here play out their own factional battles and assist Iran within the Iraqi theater. And the Hasht actions in Syria have demonstrated this lack of Iraqi government control, because Prime Minister Abadi has explicitly said for the PMUs not to be involved in Syria, and yet they continue to do so at the behest of Iran. It's not evidence of Iranian-Iraqi government conclusion, but it is demonstrating that Iran has more power in this area. The Kurds as well are playing the game in Syria. The KDP, in particular, has trained some Syrian Kurdish factions, and the Kurds themselves are extremely factional and split on their own. The KRG has, and the KDP in particular, has attempted to enter into this very messy internecine conflict, further complicating it. And this has meant that rival Kurdish factions have clashed in northern Iraq and along the border. The Sunni Arab tribes also are playing out their interests along in Syria. A lot of these tribes, cross border between the Iraq and Syria, they share family ties, tribal bonds, and sympathies with a lot of the Sunni tribes in Syria and the opposition figures there. And then there's also the very lucrative trade of weapons and fighter smuggling on that side, that there's been a lucrative business for them. The Sunni Arab tribes, they've also been encouraged and pressured by the Saudi and Gulf countries to support the Syrian opposition, but as Charles mentioned, this has gotten less over the past couple of years as their attention has waned. Now, officially, there is an Iraqi government position, which is that it officially supports the Syrian regime. They have a very tricky balancing act between their two major allies, Iran and the United States, who are on opposing sides of the Syrian conflict, obviously. So this has led to both Iraq working with the anti-ISIL coalition in Iraq, also working as part of this quadrilateral information exchange with Iran, Syria, and Russia, and being involved in a number of joint operations there. So this has been sometimes that Baghdad has been supportive of the ISIL coalition and sometimes not. So it's been very tricky for them to navigate. I won't go into it too much here because I think it's already been covered. Iran has been basically the main player in this using Iraqi factions to play its game in Syria. It's not only using its other proxies like Hezbollah and the IRGC, and they are also using these Iraqi Hash militias to operate in Syria. The Khorasani brigades in particular act as one of the main conduits for Iran there. This has been complicated because the United States has targeted some of the Iraqi Hashd who have been very close to Iran in Syria. And so Iran has threatened retaliation for those strikes. And I don't know if you've seen in the news recently that one of the methods of this retaliation is that Iran has put in some ballistic missile launchers inside Iraqi territory, at least those are the reports that are there. And so this is a very serious escalation in terms of what Iran is doing in the region. The other aspect is just the nuts and bolts type of security operation and cooperation that still need to exist between Iraq and Syria. One of them is, of course, the border. So there's been a lot of work done to bolster the border, particularly on the Iraqi side, because they're not very confident that the Syrian side is in control of that. And so they put in a lot of resources into bolstering the border. Iraq has also carried strikes, done some airstrikes into Syria. They've carried several airstrikes in Syria since 2007. And interestingly enough, they've coordinated with those with both the US coalition and with the Assad government, which is another example of these kind of convoluted arrangements that have come about in the Syrian conflict. And the Iraqi incursions into Syrian airspace, they have added another actor in an already very, very crowded sky, which again could complicate efforts. Last couple of slides is that this also has some very serious implications for the Iraqi budget and for its future stability. Obviously, there needs to be financing of all of these operations, the need to rebuild the Iraqi security sector, and which has ballooned with the inclusion of these Hasht militias into the ISF. These spending decisions also have an effect on sectarianism. For example, the KRG continually complains that it has been not allocated its standard percentage, but instead is going to be allocated based on population the way that the other provinces are. The PMUs are also complaining that they're not getting enough money. So it's forced the Iraqi government to spend exponentially more on defense and security and less on reconstruction and critical services, again, fueling that loop of instability leading to security problems. So Syria serves as a warning to Iraq, I think, first and foremost. If Iraq doesn't address these persistent weaknesses, it sees what can happen in Syria. The growth and the proliferation of armed groups, the sectarian division, the unemployment and corruption, all of these things that the major challenges that Iraq needs to address. I'll end on a optimistic note because this has been kind of a downer of a conversation with Syria. So I'll try to be as optimistic as I can about this. There is this idea that this is Iraq's first post-sectarian election. Shockingly enough, the Sadrist trend is pushing more toward Iraqi nationalism, which is kind of crazy to me because when I was first in Iraq, he was target number one for being a sectarian player and committing violence against U.S. forces there. There's also been this fragmentation with all of the 3 different sects, and so that's forced them to find allies outside of their sect, which has led to some very interesting coalitions that could be a potential future trend. And there is a real awareness now of this need for Iraqi unity and to learn the lessons from its destructive past. So I'll leave it at that because it's a lot to cover. I'm sorry I went through the last few slides quickly, but I did want to end on just this slight point of optimism going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Lydia, for clarifying one of the issues which, at least in Israel, is a bit neglected only because of the latest attacks, mysterious attacks on the Syrian-Iraqi border by a known Air Force. The subject is becoming again very fashionable. I understand you are frustrated for such a long trip and only 25 minutes of lecture, but unfortunately, I think that we don't even have time to a real discussion. Anyway, the next subject is, does ISIS have a future in Syria? We spoke a lot about ISIS, but does ISIS have a future in Syria? And Dr. Craig Whiteside will address this issue. He's associate professor at the Naval War College in Monterey, United States. It's a fellow also at the ICCT Institute, which deals only with terrorism at The Hague. He's a fellow. Also, he is a graduate at West Point and has a PhD in political science from Washington State University, and is a former U.S. Army officer with experiences in Iraq.
Thank you. Came your last speaker of the day for a very long panel, or a very long day.
No, I'm the last.
I'm sorry. You're I'm the last presenter for a long day. This is my first ICT conference. It's also my first 3-hour panel, so my kudos to you all who've hung in there. My question is a very narrow question, and I will try to talk very fast and move this along. What is the future of the Islamic State, specifically in Syria? My short answer to that, not to make this too short, is I have no idea. Right? It'd be very difficult, I think, at this point to predict the future in this particular group. However, we can look back at the past, at their past resurgence, as Lydia talked about, their past failings and their past reconstruction, resurgence in Iraq, then Syria, then Iraq, and look at that as a model to look at the political conditions, the economic conditions, and other conditions that allowed them to rise. Luckily, that was almost what my PhD was. I know we have a lot of graduate students here, right? Raise your hand if you're a graduate student. Oh, I know you're more than that, right? Come on. All right. So my original PhD topic, I thought, was going to be why did the Islamic State, the early Islamic State of Iraq, formerly Al-Qaeda in Iraq, fail? What civilian targeting, a backlash for civilian targeting, lack of integration into Sunni communities that led to the awakening Lydia talked about. These are various theories. And what I quickly found out in 2010, 2011, as I'm working on the beginnings of my PhD, is that this group was not dead, right? So we're doing an autopsy on a group that's actually still alive. And that's the case that we see today, right? So the current situation, as you can see it, it's been presented before. The Islamic State is a very small piece near Abu Kamal on the Iraq border, as Lydia described, as other people described. That's a good news story, of course. It's taken a lot of work by a lot of different groups, although certain groups claim a lot of that work and did not actually do it. All right, and some of those, we talked about some of those actors earlier. This is a hugely important vector because they have been, in terrorism studies, we tend to focus on terror acts, but this has been a group that's been focused on territory control, and they always have been. 2004 Al-Qaim, 2004 Fallujah, if you look at Baqaba in 2006, Ramadi in 2006, and then there's a dry period that goes all the way until you look at Raqqa in 2013, and then late 2013 Fallujah again. All right, but it's been valuable because that's where they get their money from, and that's where they get people and recruiting. All right. This is one of my students. So I'm a professor at the Naval War College. We study war stuff. One of my students looked at the war business, the Islamic State's war business, and he tried to do estimates, which this isn't accurate, by the way. I don't think this is accurate anymore. It's probably more accurate than the recent figures that came out from the United Nations / the member state that gave them that, which might have been the United States, as Charles said. For example, and early on, they were already about 4,000, according to Jordanian intelligence, about 4,000, peaking at over 7,000 in 2007. Then you see the dip. Lydia talked a lot about that. I won't go into great detail. Notice that they never dipped below 1,000, which is a fairly decent strength number, and it certainly was their core. And this is a period that I've focused on a lot in my research. One thing those numbers do not count are people in jail. Now think about how many people in the prisons that the United States and Iraq were sitting on in 2008 as they go through a reconciliation, which we will go through in Syria, and it was highly problematic, but those numbers could be 3 to 4 times as much if you counted people in the prisons, because these are from RAND numbers during this period, and they're looking at payroll. These are fighters out in the field, and there's a constant churn of these fighters into the prisons, out of the prisons, because they don't stay very long. But that's a churn. And then look at how quickly it jumps after 2011. There's certain reasons for that. I'll talk about a little bit of them. As a former military person, I can tell you that is a very difficult thing to do. How do you sustain that type of organizational stretch to incorporate that many people effectively? If you look at their industrial capacity, if you look at their tactics on the battlefield, they were running at a very high cylinder in 2013. And it takes a long time to build this. So my argument is that these are probably understated numbers, even now. And that's something to think about when you look at the level of numbers we're talking about in Syria. Even if 15,000 is way too high and we're talking 5,000, we saw what they could do very quickly. And the trigger for that is many different things. I don't want to simplify a very complex set of reasons why the Islamic State was able to resurge after 2011, but a large part of it was the withdrawal of large combat forces from Iraq that allowed them the space to get a little bit more creative. All right? Okay, so let's go to this. This is a project I'm working on with some of my graduate students at Middlebury Institute at Monterey, California. We took the Islamic State's claim, not Global Terrorism Database, if you're familiar with Global Terrorism Database. Of course, it focuses on terror attacks, which is mostly on civilians. This is on military targets and civilians, any military activity, as I put at the top. And you can see there's an immediate jump after the end of 2011 when the last U.S. forces, which means the last of surveillance, the last of human contact, intelligence gathering. All of this leaves at that point and then allows a large-scale jump in activities. And you even see things like, in another one of my research projects, is special operations starting to happen in 2012 in order to start this campaign of increased activity. And that even includes, we have gaps in the data. We can't find some of these claims that they're famous. You can see these on a mock and they're in Telegram today, but back then they were put on password-protected forms, which we're able to collect even retrospectively. So what are some of the so what's on this particular one? one, again, this idea that they had died in the first place, I've come to contest. I believed it when I was in Iraq in 2007. I could believe what I saw with my own eyes. But upon research, investigation, looking at documents of the group, I've come to a different opinion, which is that they are good at strategic patience, and I'll talk about that as well. There's a late 2009 strategy document that they wrote. It's called the document to improve the political position of the Islamic State, the Dawla Islamiyya, 2009. Right? They've called themselves the Dawla Islamiyya, by the way, since 2006. We called them Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which helped us understand them, but it's not exactly how they saw themselves. And I think that's important as well. Okay. Okay. I've taken this group apart to see what makes them tick. Who are they? One of the things they're very good at is putting together different coalitions of groups from different folks. That's different than what we've understood them to be. A very monolithical, maybe even run by Baathists as a front organization, or not really an ideological. This is kind of a front. It's made up of a lot of different groups, which tells me they again have the organizational flexibility to integrate different groups. So as you see the end game in Syria happen, much like the end game that Lydia described in Iraq, you're going to see them, and they already know the playbook. They already know how to do this from Iraq, pick off people who don't want to reconcile with the Assad regime. There are going to be a lot of pragmatists in the Syrian resistance that decide that the best thing to do if they want to go home, if they even include in prison time, is to go ahead and reconcile. There are going to be a lot of those that cannot. And the Islamic State's always known that. They picked off the Sawa members, the awakening members that didn't stick, as Lydia described it accurately. They've picked off other resistance groups that ended up collaborating with the US government, in this case think of Assad, and picked those groups off, the defectors within those groups. We talk about groups moving, Charles talked about groups moving to different coalitions. They don't take all their people. There are people in them that will dissent and defect, and they will need a place to go. What the Islamic State's always had going for them is consistency. And in this case, it will remain the same. They will always be against the Assad regime. And that, for people who cannot change their political ideology, political goals, that will be an important part. So they're made up of a lot of different parts. Some of their very famous people, like Abu Bakr, come from the Iraqi Salafis. But you look at Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, their longtime spokesman, 2009 to 16, he was their spokesman. It was a Syrian who joined in 2002. One of their most famous military commanders, Abu Jara al-Shami, was a Syrian who came as well very early on, fought in AQI, made the transition to the Islamic State, and then eventually is killed outside of Ramadi in 2007. Always talked about, back then, going back to Syria eventually, once there was a crack, once there was an opportunity. The networks that will be interested in this fast forward is Syria, right? Talking Syria now, will be the prison converts, prison releases, those kind. If you look at the defectors, so I have Sawa defectors post-2009 in the Iraqi context, although if you listen to Islamic State propaganda, they call anyone who's a Sunni collaborator Sahwa, right? The Sahwa of Syria, even though there is no such thing, right, Charles?
Not yet.
Yeah, I mean, there is no, they're not yet. There's always room for something else to happen in Syria. But there is no Sunni Sawa. But the Islamic State's already thinking of Syria, and they're taking the Iraq model. And then finally, the resistance stalwarts as well, the people who never reconcile, as I mentioned. So this is the... So what I decided to do for you was to give the positive aspects that are positive from the Islamic State's perspective. Again, a lot of my research is done from the Islamic State perspective. What's going well for them even now? As you saw the map, not a lot of things going well. One, they were transitioning back to an insurgency long before Raqqa and Mosul fell. You could see this happening. They had understood maybe as early as 2016 that they were going to lose their urban areas to large ground forces that were proxies of large powers. And they've lived through that before during the surge operations in Iraq. And what they understood, the 2007 transition was very difficult for them because they fought it and lost badly to the Sawa, but also the surge brigades. What I think they did in a lot of these places was leave stay-behind forces behind and already start to transition their people back into sleeper cells, into underground insurgencies, into dispersed cells. Resource them, finance them, and send them on their ways. And I think you see that transition because you're seeing a quicker bounce back than you saw in 2007, if you remember the previous slide, which is Iraqi data. But if you look already, particularly in Iraq, you see the bounce back in Iraq now, but they have about twice as many incidents as you do in Syria. Number two, you can see that the coalition has culminated already early. Because they're still an Islamic State, right? That was the stated goal of the Trump administration. It wasn't the defeat of the Islamic State. It was the elimination of the Islamic State, the complete destruction. There's a culmination that's happened, which is they have not been able to do that, and now they're still talking about a final campaign to push them out of their last area of Syria. You see the Syrian government making the co-option of the rivals. As I mentioned before, that's going to drive people to them. They won't be included in a peace deal, but that's a good thing for this group because they have political goals that are irreconcilable with any kind of peace deal here. Frozen reconstruction. The funds to reconstruct Syria will be frozen until there's a political deal that was discussed earlier, and that did not happen in Iraq. What you saw was reconstruction going on the entire time, as well as maybe even increase of reconstruction as the Islamic State was defeated its first time around. You're not seeing that at all. There will be little to no reconstruction until there's a larger political settlement, which will be in the benefit of this particular group, allow them to maybe come back. Overcrowded prisons, it's a huge problem, and it's a problem that we should have learned from the time before because the prison problem is what refed. Every Islamic State leader that I studied in 2007 to 2013 had done time in Bucca. They weren't radicalized there, they were radicalized before they went to Bucca, and they came out, but they came out with new friends, new contacts, and had probably recruited extensively due to their own kind of legitimacy as a jihadi resistant fighter, had recruited extensively while they were in prison. Then finally, unrealistic U.S. goals. Again, the U.S. is starting to modify that rhetoric a little bit with a sustained defeat of the Islamic State, which is a better terminology, I think, than this idea of eliminating them. That sets up a false expectation, and now we're reading stories about the resurgence of the Islamic State in the Atlantic and other articles. I think those are overblown, like the numbers as well. The data does not show any kind of serious resurgence, but people who are saying this because they expected them to be completely defeated, which is, it has not happened to the group, even in the days that we talk about them as defeated and, ISIS rising from the remnants. Like, they're not the remnants. Abu Bakr is the same person he was when he joined the group in probably 2005, but officially in public release in 2006 when it was proclaimed the Islamic State. Same people, same type of organization. They've just expanded into many different countries. That's how we have trouble understanding them. Let's look at the negative side of the, negative side of the ledger. What they didn't have in Iraq that they do have in Syria to contend with is a rival, legitimate jihadi group that's Salafi and truly Salafi in nature, as Charles has written about in his book, but also talked about. That's huge. They did not have that. They had people who pretended they were Salafis, the Islamic Army of Iraq, but I really doubt significantly that they were truly Salafi because they worked with the United States. That is not a very Salafi thing to do. So they have this coherent rival that has more numbers than them in Syria and has probably better ideas. Of course, Jolani isn't a veteran of the Islamic State of Iraq and probably a former emir of Mosul. So he understands how the group does business. He understands the model. He has improvements on that model, which are probably, unfortunately for us, good improvements. The loss of economic resources, with territorial losses come economic resources. They saved roughly, from what I've seen estimates, about $500 million and spirited that away again in this successful transition to insurgency. However, that's not going to go very far because fighter salaries is their #1 expense. They still pay for widows and this and that. I mean, that actually is not going to go very far. So if they're not, the flip side is they do a good job at generating income at the criminal level. Which is what they did in Iraq. They didn't control territory in Iraq prior to late 2013, but they certainly made a lot of money doing it. One thing I think would be interesting to research for you graduate students is they survived their first bust, but can you survive a double bust? I mean, is it too hard to come back twice, even if people tell you it's ordained or it's in the prophetic or any other rationale you have to keep fighting? I'm surprised that they have the motivation to keep fighting like they are, considering the significant setbacks, the amount of people they've lost. So that would be really interesting to look at insurgencies or terror groups or terror insurgency hybrids that have survived multiple failures already, and how that has to do with morale. The foreign fighters are high and dry because they cannot be protected if they lose the last bit of territory they have. It's very difficult. They found that out in 2007, and they literally told people to stop coming to Iraq in 2008 because it was very difficult to shelter them, especially when you had Sunnis who were collaborating with the government. It became almost impossible. So that's on the downside. Most interestingly, a couple people talking about it is the ideological fissure they have. The extremists, the Hazmi problem, it's called. You can look up Cole Bunzel's work on it. They have, and they've always had it. I was just doing some research. I have a piece coming out this week on their Counter-Sawa campaign with the ICCT, publishing it this week. It looks at 2007 to date on how they've done this Counter-Sawa program that Lydia talked about. But there's slogans and strategies of that. And you see that early fissure when they decided to offer repentance, as Lydia described it, to those who collaborated with the Americans and the foreigners, the infidels. When they offered repentance to them, they had their own people who fought that and said, you can't. And we actually had someone who burned 3 Sunni tribal fighters alive in 2007. Think about that, long before the Jordanian pilot in 2015. And they quickly policed that up and never made a video. They didn't release that video, right? But it got out to the internet, and so they have this problem of the extremists. And of course, we're talking, this is a relative problem, right? I mean, they're all extremists, but they have extremists within their extremists that they have trouble fighting. They're actually having a social media war right now. Some of you might have picked up on it, of this kind of internal bickering, blaming Abu Bakr, who deserves lots of blame, by the way, for the destruction of the caliphate. But it's because he wasn't hard enough. It's because he's too soft. So that's a problem. And then finally, one of the negative problems they have is that the U.S. is entirely focused on them. That's been a problem for them in the past. It is a current problem for them because the U.S. is not worried. They're not trying to do too many things. They are focused on destroying this organization, hopefully for good. And that's, they have that 2009 strategy document that I referenced earlier, and I'll end on this. It literally says it's 55 pages. It says nothing about the apocalypse, by the way. Nothing. 2009, when things are terrible. Nothing about the apocalypse. What it does say is 9 bullets for the apostates, meaning Sunnis who've turned against them, Sunnis. 1 bullet for the crusaders, the enemy. Meaning we're going to save our ammunition, which it actually says in the document as well. We're going to focus on fixing our internal problems, our local problems, very localized, and we'll let the United States leave. That's what it says. Why would we waste money in the United States? They've already said they're leaving, and they're going to go. They don't have that. They might not have that luxury right now. That's a big wild card in what's going to happen in the future. If Trump wins out over his policy advisors, which I'm told is Trump versus all of his policy advisors on Syria, if Trump wins out, he got a 6-month extension. They got a 6-month extension from Trump, is what I think Charles told me, right? That's not attributable. That if that 6 months comes and goes and Trump remembers, then then the Islamic State will get a reprieve from that. Otherwise, they're going to have the full attention of a fairly powerful military and its proxies, if they're able to sustain that, against the group, and that's the negative. And that's what I'll end with. Thank you for your time and patience.
Thanks, Craig, for this enlightening presentation about a subject which is not always clear. Now, if you are not tired, I have the schizophrenic task to present two more players. Perhaps you forgot about them, Turkey and Israel. So I'll begin with Turkey. I'll do like Ilan, full presentation about Turkey and a very short presentation about Israel. And if we'll have time, I am ready to continue until 6 o'clock, if you are ready to,
I think
yes?
there's a special thing at 6, so I think we're supposed to be
6 o'clock.
5:45.
Okay, but if the people know, they need this.
There's another session
Here?
at 6.
This is the
Another
second.
one.
Okay, okay.
I think
So,
5:45.
Turkey. Turkey's dilemma in Syria. Erdogan, which was a personal friend of Bashar al-Assad and his family, became his fiercest enemy when Assad, after several months of oppressing the opposition, the rebels, especially the Pacific ones, did not hear the advice by Erdogan to try to be more moderate and to try to find an arrangement. And this decided Erdogan to go in full stream, if you want, against the Syrian regime in Damascus. And he supported practically almost all of the opposition from the beginning. First of all, the Syrian Free Army, then the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, because he is a Muslim Brotherhood, and by the way, he hoped to support the Muslim Brotherhood regime, future regime in Syria. But most of the Muslim Brotherhood controlled the outside opposition, not the opposition on the ground. So little by little, he began to support also the more jihadist and Salafist groups, including from time to time also Jabhat al-Nusra, and from time to time closing the eyes to the activity, especially the activity through the borders of Turkey by ISIS. Turkey's goals, or rather, if you want, Erdogan's goals in the civil war in Syria is, first of all, to present himself as the leader of the united Muslim world. Actually, we know from his Minister of Foreign Affairs, his advisor Davutoglu, that he wants a revival of kind of a neo-Ottoman state. Turkey, by the way, was almost for 1 decade the chairman of the Organization of the Islamic Countries. So he thought that the fight in Syria for the Sunnis will present him, or he'll help him to present himself as a unifier of the Sunni world. Then he wanted to have a predominant influence in Syria itself, if possibly also geographically, because we must remember that Syria had some revanchist ideas about the territory of Hatay, which was attached to Turkey after the Second World War. So this also explains his territorial attempts to remain in Syria. But the main issue that influenced his strategy, especially in the last 2 years, is the impact of the Kurdish attempts of autonomy and independence in northern Syria on the sensitive issue of the big Kurdish minority in Turkey itself, which is mainly led, if you want, by the PKK, former Marxist organization, but clearly a very strong nationalist organization inside and separatist organization inside Turkey. So at this moment, actually, this is the most pressing issue for Ankara. Therefore, from the point of view of Turkey, the military intervention of Russia inside Syria in 2015 was a very negative event, and especially that already at that time the Russians had very good relationship with the Kurds, by the way, historic relations, and even Moscow hosted the representatives of the Kurdish Democratic Union Party. And then Turkish fighters downed a Russian Sukhoi 24 fighter, which was staged at the Syrian Latakia airport. And this provoked a huge crisis between the two countries when President Putin responded with a huge economic sanctions against Turkey, which influenced, by the way, quite clearly the Turkish economy. But surprisingly, the Russian-Turkish relations recovered quite quickly. And practically, if you want, even lately, Ankara decided to buy anti-aerial Russian missiles S-400, which provoked, among other issues, the BRIC crisis between Turkey and the United States, and Turkey and NATO. And for the moment, by the way, there is not clear end to this important crisis between former important allies, Turkey, United States, and NATO. By Putin's, I think, greatest success in his strategy vis-à-vis Turkey has been to co-opt Erdogan in his attempt for a political solution, diplomatic solution in Syria, what we call the Pax Russica or Pax Russia, together with Iranians, which was, I think it was very difficult to think about such a coalition or such an axis or triangle between the three powers. Now, let's see what is the situation on the ground. By the way, this photo is taken every time Erdogan is receiving a head of state in his 650 million palace that he built. Biggest, I think, that the Ceausescu Palace. And these are soldiers which represent the 16 former Ottoman empires. Okay, so this is symbolic from his point of view to present himself as a sultan. Sorry? Now, what happens just these days, because the last stronghold of the opposition we spoke about, it is in Idlib there in northwest. And the problem for Erdogan is that in this province, which actually threatens the heartland of the Alawi regime, is half occupied by pro-Turkish or sponsored Turkish troops, and the Tahrir, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the former Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the former Al-Qaeda fraction, which has a very strong presence, military, but also politically, because they are succeeded in organizing, on the one hand, a military coalition with other smaller groups, and also a kind of administration of this region. So from the point of view of Turkey, this is a threat that if the Russians, together with the Iranians and the Hezbollah and the regime, succeed in practically dissolving this kind of pocket inside Syria, Turkish influence in the northern Syria will disappear. And this, after a period, if you see here the problem of the Kurds in northern Syria, which are not occupying all this territory, but still this is the strategic goal of the Kurds in Syria, to have a contiguous territory and even to arrive at the Mediterranean Sea. And this is the threat, how the Turks see the Kurdish, the People's Protection Units, which are actually kind of faction or branch of the PKK in Turkey. And you see here the famous women fighters with the picture of Öcalan, which is a kind of dictator, but a very charismatic leader of the Turks in Turkey and in northern Syria. Now, in order to neutralize this threat, Turkey has staged several operations. We see it was in 2016, 3 operations, which actually the occupation of Afrin, but before that Adrai and Jarablus, trying to cut the connection between the various cantons of the Kurds, and their attempt also to throw out the American troops, which were the allies of the Kurds, because the Kurds was the best allies in the fighting against ISIS in Syria, but also in Iraq. So these operations, by the way, were supported by the Russians, which had already some presence here, there, including in Afrin. And the Turks hope that this will remain in their possession, at least for until there will be a positive solution. But now, if Idlib is destroyed as a stronghold of the Turkish presence, then these successes, territorial successes, will practically disappear. And here is the Idlib city, and the Idlib territory, we see it is contiguous to Turkey. For the moment, the only country from where they can communicate and receive support, economic and military support, is from Turkey. And the Turks have to decide the day after tomorrow, in the meeting in Iran between Putin, Erdogan, and Rouhani, what will be the solution for this problem? The Russians already began, after 3 weeks of quiet, to bomb Idlib. And the question is, this is a message to Erdogan, you see, we already began, you don't have a choice. And I think Erdogan is in a very, very difficult position, because if he's losing this territory, and he's losing afterwards the territory in the Kurdish territory, in Afrin and Manbij, then practically he has a strategic failure in all his policy, which already has been very difficult in Syria, not only on the Syrian front, not only on the regional front, but also in the internal front, because for the moment, Erdogan has still control of the parliament and even of the presidency because of the alliance with the nationalists, which are the most anti-Kurdish elements inside Turkey. So from the point of view of Erdogan, the fate of Idlib can in many ways influence his own political fate. And so we see here that all the players have practically points of control in this area, and the next days, the next weeks will be fateful for the solution of this. Now, as I said, there is a continuous crisis between the United States and Turkey, because they wanted the United States troops to leave Manbij and also to expel the Kurds from Manbij on the east of the Euphrates. Now, the Turks, or the Turkish government, has published this secret map of the American bases in northern Syria. At that time, they wanted to convince or to press the Americans to leave. But I think that now they need them in order to balance the Russians. And so the question is how the game between Erdogan and Putin on the one hand, and Erdogan and Trump on the other hand, which have various problems, as I said, not only the Syrian problem, but also the arrest of the priest, of the pastor and the S-400, all these problems, how he will solve in the next days, especially under the pressure of the Iranian president and the Russian president. To see the complexity from the point of view of Syria, because the Kurds are also in Iraq, Turkey has some troops in Iraq, has some crisis with the Baghdad government because they need this presence. They would like to have some presence in the Kirkuk oil area. They want to support or to help or to defend the Turkmens, the 3% of the population Turkmens that live in this area, and also they want to control any attempt of autonomy, either in northern Syria or independence in the northern Iraq. I think it will be very interesting next week to see exactly what happens in this area. Now about Israel. I would say that the Israeli interest in Syria is Iran, and Hezbollah. I think this is how our prime minister is presenting the threats to Israel. In this sense, I think the Israeli political and military establishment has understood after a long time, I think from my point of view, since the 1996 operation in southern Lebanon by then General Barak, the head of the chief of staff, and later as Minister of Defense in the 2000s, Prime Minister, and Minister of Defense. I think that Israeli leadership has understood that we cannot accept a new Lebanon in southern Syria. We permitted Lebanon to become actually a puppet of the Iranians through Hezbollah. Today, the Hezbollah is controlling part of the territory, is bigger than the Lebanese army. The Lebanese army is practically cooperating with Hezbollah in the south and also against the jihadists on the border with Syria. The parliament is predominantly pro-Hezbollah and pro-Iranian, and the president of Lebanon has declared that Hezbollah is the legitimate defender of Lebanon. And they have 120,000 missiles and rockets, which actually are the only tool, strategic tool of Iran against Israel in case of a war. I think that our leadership has understood that we cannot permit at any price what happens in Syria with the entrenchment of the Iranians. And for the first time, you hear voices like the Minister of Defense or Minister of Culture, of Education, saying we will bomb, we will attack also Tehran, not only Lebanon, because I think the attempt to represent the Lebanon as the responsible for the Hezbollah war, in case it will happen, and to destroy all the infrastructure in Lebanon. It is a crazy idea, in my opinion, because this means that we'll destroy not only the Shiites, but also the Sunni, the Christians, and the Druze, and Israel cannot permit them itself. But if the Iranians are responsible, we have to deter, first of all, the Iranians. And I think the Iranians can be deterred, and they understand what is deterrence, on the condition that this is a very thoroughly implemented strategy. And I am very critical of the Israeli government on other issues, especially on the issues of Gaza and perhaps also internal issues like the policy vis-à-vis the Palestinians. But in this issue, I think that for the moment, until today, the Israeli government has been very successful and very right in its strategy vis-à-vis Iran. Now, I think that we have some 10 minutes, 5 minutes for questions and answers. I am very sorry that, but at least we had a very rich panel, I think, a good presentation, excellent presentation, and I want to thank them for their participation and their success. We have 5 minutes. Perhaps with
This session at 6 is a closed thing as well, so we can probably go a bit longer.
They say that they have to use this room for another session. No, no. If you want, if you are ready.
There's time for questions.
Okay. No, because you said before that.
No, there's time for questions, because you want
Okay.
time for
No,
questions.
it's 6 o'clock. Okay. Okay. So
Whoever wants to, there's
we
a
have
session at
until
6.
6 o'clock. So if you want to ask questions, please, to the panelists. Yes, please. Do you have a microphone for someone? Yes.
There's deep confliction going on in Syria between the United States and Israel.
Between the United States and Israel?
Occasionally there's attacks that occur, and my understanding is that it's with Russian blessing, or at least Russian not interference. Could you comment on that a bit?
On the Russian position.
Yeah.
I think. Okay. Do I have my microphone here? Okay. Since the very beginning, it was very clear that we are, in the Russian eyes, we are Israel. We're a very important regional player. And the relationships with Israel, which have been developed since 2 last decades, are seen by the Russians as a very important asset, geopolitical asset. So they do not want to harm them. They do see our importance for the future of the region and for the future of new Syria. So they try to understand our positions and to allow us to do in Syria what they can allow us to do, what do not really harm their interests. In some cases, they are trying to prevent different Israeli actions, but in the cases that do not harm their interests, immediate interests in Syria, they do tend to allow a policy of a kind of policy of free hand for Israel. Again, because we are seen by them as a very important partner in a series of fields, starting from the technological cooperation and ending with our support of the historiography of the Second World War, which is a very important tool in their relationships with their neighbors in Europe. Okay, so that's the reason, I think.
I would like I didn't have time because we have also a very complex relationship with Russia, like Turkey, if you want. Russian interest is not to have Iran as the main strategic ally in Syria. They want to control Syria as a basis for their own needs, and they are afraid that too much involvement of Iran, militarily, culturally, politically, will be bothering for their strategic goal on the long term. Second is that they have a very, I will say, good evaluation of what Israel can do to the Russian forces. Since the Sinai War, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, all the attempts to support the Arab allies, beginning with Nasser, then the Syrians and the Algerians, all the influence and investments in the Arab armies were counterproductive. We destroyed everything. We found a solution for every technological Soviet weapon. And we even destroyed in one fight in Egypt, 5 MiGs, which provoked the expulsion at the end of the Soviet presence, extraterritorial presence in Egypt by President Sadat. So they understand that here in Syria, if there will be a conflict, it's not clear what fighter will fall, okay? This is a kind of, I would say, psychological element in, I would say, negative, okay? But they have to take it in consideration. They have to take in consideration that we have a solution for S-300 and S-400. And if they will be destroyed, like we destroyed in Lebanon, all the Syrian defense forces in '82, we destroyed 82 planes in 3 hours. This will be a huge blow to Russian prestige, to Russian weapons, and to Russian possibility to sell these weapons. Then they want to have a political and religious role in Jerusalem. You know that they recognized West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel 1 year before Trump. And they said it. They said, okay, East Jerusalem will be in the end or in the future, perhaps the capital of the Palestinians. And although 16, I think, European countries did not accept to come to the event that our foreign minister organized in Jerusalem, they organized a special event for, I don't know what, National Day or something in Jerusalem. Because they have, since the 15th, 16th century, a very important religious presence, and the Orthodox Church is a very important ally internally for Putin. When they went to fight in Syria, the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church issued a decree that he is supporting the fight against those which attack the Christians in Syria and in the Middle East. And there also there is some kind of personal relationship, not only between Netanyahu, some chemistry, but the fact that Putin thinks of the Israeli-Russian, or the Russians living in Israel as a kind of a diaspora, which are propagating the Russian culture. He personally had a personal professor, I think a lady, which taught him, I think, piano, and he bought personally an apartment for this lady in Israel. So there is a very complex, if you want, on the personal level, on the historical level, and on the strategic level, sufficient elements that put Russia in a special position vis-à-vis Israel.
Do you think, follow up?
Sorry.
Do you think that Russia will be a governor on Iran? Just you mentioned in passing that it will set red
Yeah, I think they have, vis-à-vis Iran, they have two red lines, the upper one and the lower one. The lower one is they see the Iranians, Iran as a very useful asset in the region and also outside in Afghanistan, for example. So in no situation, I think they will allow to West to annihilate the current regime in Tehran, okay? On the other hand, I think they have this upper red line. They will not, they don't want to see Iran, as was presented here, as a kind of regional empire and not nuclearized one, okay? And very assertive in the former Soviet Union. So here I think we have the point of interests, how to say, conversion, yeah, between Israel and Russia. So they will try to push Iranians back into their previous position, okay, and they will try even to cooperate with Israel in containing Iranians in this position.
There we go. We're gonna do this all day long. I think that's exactly right, and I think there's a bit of a learning curve that's taken place, at least in U.S. policy, towards the sort of the balance of power between Russia and Iran and Syria. The conventional wisdom for a while in Washington, certainly among the folks in government that I talked to, was that that Russia was sort of the power, the preeminent power in Syria. The reality is, though, that if you look at Russian rhetoric domestically, and also if you look at Iranian rhetoric domestically, the answer is actually the reverse, right? Iran is the one that talks about not having an exit strategy. Iran doesn't de-escalate. Iran has talked about an open-ended presence. That means that Russia, if it wants to stay, if it wants to maintain a long-term military basing presence and long-term military freedom of action throughout the country, has to stay in Iran's good graces. And so anything that diminishes Iran in terms of strategic weight in Syria actually benefits Russia, because it loosens the authority of Iran. It sort of gives Russia freer sweep. So in this particular case, as Eli said, there's this confluence of factors where Russia is perfectly willing to allow Israel to target Iran within certain limits, because a diminished Iran actually means an expanded Russia. Please.
Thank you, everybody. I've just come back from Kurdistan. I spent some time with the Peshmerga, with the KDP. I'm learning about their financial hardship. Peshmerga officers are selling their vehicles to support their family. Peshmerga officers cannot buy milk for their children. Seems universally people think it was foolish to go for the referendum. Two theoretical questions. How would things change if somehow there was Kurdish independence? And what would happen if there's no hope of independence? One of the Peshmerga said to me, we know that there will be conflict, but we won't be facing only the Iraqi armed forces. We will be facing Iran as well. So can you speculate on both scenarios?
Lydia?
Don't knock anything over.
I've done well this time. Thanks for your question, and I think that the difficulties that the KRG is facing is those examples that you've been citing, and even more. I think that on a very deep level, I think the Iraqi Kurds know that if they declare independence or try to make any additional moves toward independence, it will be a disaster for them. The 2007 referendum move was extremely ill-advised. The majority of Iraqi Kurds actually did not want it. The PUK pushed the KDP against it. The reasons for why Barzani wanted to push forward for it, I think, are complicated, but primarily because of his unpopular political position, and he wanted to shore himself up. And I think Barzani has a history of acting very narrowly in this space. I mean, the Kurds are very adept players, and they can play the strategic game, but Barzani in particular has shown some impatience and some mistakes that have been made in his rashness in terms of trying to get independence. So I think that on the Iraqi Kurdish side, if they did make any more moves at this stage for greater independence, it would be a disaster for them. They've always said, and I think what they want, the ideal scenario, I think, for them would be to consolidate their autonomy. How they develop links with the other Kurdish factions, I think, is going to be problematic for them as well, because the Syrian Kurds are also very, very factionalized. They had resisted Barzani's moves for training Syrian Kurds, for having the Syrian Kurds that he trained to operate in Syria. So this idea that there's like this kind of unified Kurdish swath is not at all accurate, and it would be very difficult, I think, for all of them to come together to form some sort of contiguous Kurdish state. But for the Iraqi Kurds in particular, they're kind of in that precarious game, but yet they also can sometimes be very lucky. They have found themselves again in this position of kingmaker in these new after the elections. There's no Iraqi coalition that have been formed, and a governing coalition. And the one that is formed, I think, is the one that's going to get the Kurds on side. So the Kurds have put forward a list of 14 demands, I believe, and they said whichever is the first coalition to acquiesce to them will join with them and form government. So there's some positives going for the Kurds and some negatives going for the Kurds.
And just what does the United States feel? Because one of the generals said to me, we are not a private militia. We are treated as a private militia. And I live in the United States, I'm an American, and we see our American capitalization. We pounded ISIS with these guys on the ground. So what moral responsibility do we have? And what if we said we're going to be with an independent Iraqi Kurdistan? What would then happen to the rest of Iraq and the region?
So from
The other scenario.
So, I think that's been a longstanding kind of complaint of the Kurds. They always say, we have no friends but the mountains. That's their rallying cry, and they're constantly complaining of being, and I think to a degree that they are right, that they are not valued as much as they are. They can list a long litany of betrayals that they have faced from the United States and other places. So I think that the U.S. obligation to the Kurds is a complicated one. I mean, they were instrumental, obviously, in the fight against the Islamic State. They were instrumental in 2003. So they have that sense of an obligation. They have a lot of sympathetic voices in their favor within the United States as well. At the same time, they also need to get their act together. They have been their own worst enemy in many senses. Like, they put out this idea that they are this beacon of democracy in a chaotic region. That is absolutely the furthest thing from the case. I mean, basically the Iraqi KRG is run by two warlords. So unless they get that under control, it's very difficult for the United States to support fully this idea of an independent Kurdistan or even more autonomous Kurdistan.
But surely infinitely better than a puppeted government in Baghdad controlled by Iran. And that would be the final word.
I'm sorry, but the buses are waiting for the guests, so I have to close. I want to say thanks to my assistant Alexis, to the panelists, and see you in the next conference. Sorry very much for it.
Oh, that's fine. That's all right. I think 20 minutes is.